Hi, listeners. This is the 80,000 Hours podcast, where we have unusually in-depth conversations about the world's most pressing problems, what you can do to solve them, and what really knocked off the giant ground sloth. I'm Rob Wiblin, head of research at 80,000 Hours. This is Will's fourth appearance on the show, and he's one of our most consistently popular guests, so I'll forego the usual guest introduction here. Today we're discussing Will's new book, What We Owe the Future, which is all about long-termism, and I expect is going to make a big splash over the next month. If you already know a fair bit about long-termism, or have listened to Will talk about the book on another podcast, you could potentially skip forward to about minute 25, or the chapter called Will's Personal Journey, if you want to get to things you likely haven't heard before. But the first 25 minutes is still pretty interesting, whether you're new to all of this or not, and it has some stuff that would have been new to me. So I wouldn't say you should skip forward, just that you've always got that option if you prefer. Here's a teaser for two quick notices I'm going to cover in full in the outro. First, we haven't gotten as many responses to our user survey as we would like in order to be confident that we're getting a full picture of all of your experiences with 80,000 Hours. So we are extending the deadline for that one by 2 days to give you more time to fill it out. So this year's entries will now close on Wednesday, so please go to 80,000hours.org/survey before then if you can. We're also currently looking for a marketer to join the 80,000 Hours team, and applications for that close on the 23rd. If you got that role, you would have the chance to promote this podcast, along with many other services that 80,000 Hours offers. You can find out about that role at 80,000hours.org/marketer, or hear a bit more about it by skipping to the outro for this episode. All right, with that tiny bit of housekeeping out of the way, I bring you Will MacAskill. Today, I'm speaking with Will MacAskill, who will be well known to many people as a co-founder of the effective altruism community. Will is an associate professor of philosophy at Oxford University, director of the Forethought Foundation for Global Priorities Research, and an advisor to the New Future Fund. In his academic capacity, Will is published in philosophy journals such as Mind, Ethics, and the Journal of Philosophy, while in his capacity as an entrepreneur, he co-founded Given What We Can, the Centre for Effective Altruism, and our very own 80,000 Hours, and remains a trustee on all those various boards. Back in 2015, he published Doing Good Better. In 2020, he published Moral Uncertainty. And now, in August 2022, he's releasing his third book titled What We Owe the Future, which is the topic of today's conversation. Thanks for returning to the podcast, Will.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Today, we are basically just going to be talking about all sorts of different aspects of long-termism. Considerations in its favor, arguments against it, what it concretely implies, if anything, whether we should expect the future to be good or bad, whether anything we can do now can actually change the values of people hundreds or thousands of years in the future, and so on. But before that, we should really talk about what long-termism actually is. When you talk about long-termism today, and I guess in the book, What We Owe the Future, what specifically do you mean by that term?
Long-termism is the view that positively influencing the long-term future is a key moral priority of our time. So it's about taking seriously just how much is at stake when we look to humanity's future, and then trying to figure out what are the events or challenges that could be pivotal in humanity's long-run trajectory, and ensuring that we act responsibly and carefully to navigate civilization onto a better path.
Okay, so you say it's a top priority. Why not kind of the overwhelming priority or the only priority? That might seem a natural extension of this idea.
Well, there are a variety of strengths of view you could have. So one is just saying it's one of the things that we as a society should really care about. That's long-termism. Saying it's, the key priority, it's the most important thing, would be what I call strong long-termism. And then you could imagine an even stronger view that's saying it's overwhelmingly important. And I think there's two reasons for just focusing on the weaker claim, just it's a priority. Firstly is that from a practical perspective, it doesn't really make any difference. At the moment, how much does society spend trying to preserve and safeguard and, navigate the world and challenges for future generations? Maybe it's 0.1% of society's resources. I think that should be higher. Should it be 1%, 10%, more? At the moment, it doesn't really matter, because if we get to 1% of society's resources, I will be a very happy man. And then the second reason is just, how confident am I in different views? I feel very confident in the weak form, just among different priorities we should have. The long-term future of our species should be one. The idea that it's the most important thing is much more controversial, and so it's, something I'm kind of less happy to stand up in public and defend.
Yeah. Okay, let's dive straight into the case for long-termism. I guess, what's the number one argument you maybe want people to keep in mind in favor of having a long-termist worldview?
I think the core argument is very simple. It's that future people matter morally. It's that there could be enormous numbers of future people. And then finally, that we can make a difference to the world they inhabit. So we really can make a difference to all of those lives that may be lived.
Okay. I guess we should probably take those piece by piece. So the first one is just the future could be really big in expectation. Do you want to explain why you think that?
Sure. So Homo sapiens have been around for about 300,000 years. If we live as long as a typical mammal species, we will survive for hundreds of thousands of years. If we last until the Earth is no longer habitable, we will last for hundreds of millions of years. If one day we take to the stars and have a civilization that is interstellar, then we could survive for hundreds of trillions of years. I don't know which of those it will be. I think we should give some probability to all of them, and as well as some probability to the near-term extinction, maybe within our lifetimes or the coming centuries. But taking that all into account, and even on the kind of low estimates, such as us living as long as a typical mammal species, the future is truly vast. So on that low estimate, there is about 1,000 people in the future for every person alive today. When we look at those longer timescales that civilization could last for, there are millions, billions, or even trillions of people to come for every person alive today.
Yeah. So on one level, it's pretty natural for people to care about how the future is going to go. Yeah, you give some nice examples to try to make this intuitive in the book. Do you mind going through one or two of those?
For sure. I mean, one thing is just imagine you're hiking on a trail, you drop some glass, and suppose you know that in 100 years' time, someone will cut themselves on that glass. Is it any reason at all for not taking the time to clean up after yourself that the person who will be harmed lives in 100 years' time?
Or hasn't been born yet.
Or hasn't even been born. And it seems like the answer is no. Or if you could prevent a genocide in 1,000 years versus 10,000 years versus 100,000 years, and it will kill 100,000 people, does it make any difference when those lives will be lived? Again, it just seems like intuitively not. Harm is harm wherever it occurs. And in that way, distance in time is quite like distance in space. The fact that someone will suffer is bad in and of itself, even if they live on the other side of the world. The fact that someone will suffer is bad in and of itself, even if they will live 10,000 years from now. So I think when we reflect on thought experiments like this, we see that, we want to give a lot of moral weight to future people. And in many other areas where we know will have long-term impact, so disposal of radioactive nuclear waste, for example, it's just perfectly common sense that the fact that this waste will be radioactive to some extent for hundreds of thousands of years, well, we should think a little bit about, how do we ensure that we're not harming people in the far future? And that just seems really pretty common sense. Yeah. And so I think there is a strong element of common sense, at least in this idea that future people matter morally. That's just really a pretty common sense idea.
Yeah, I think that the thing that strikes even deeper for me on a gut level is, so lots of projects that we participate in, like trying to do scientific research to cure cancer, or building buildings that are going to last for a very long time, or writing novels that people might read in the future. Obviously, part of the motivation is knowing that these benefits the benefits of the work that we're doing will accrue for a very long time. If we just found out that humanity was going to disappear in 2040 or 2070 even, I think it would make doing scientific research at great cost today. Doing costly innovations, building infrastructure that ideally could last for a very long time. It would make it all feel a lot less worthwhile, at least in my mind.
Absolutely. There's this proverb I really love, which is, "A society grows great when old men plant seeds for trees under whose shade they will never sit."
Yeah.
And I think that's just a very resonant idea that what makes for a meaningful, great society is one where we're playing a sort of relay race with our ancestors and our descendants. We're taking the projects that they have bestowed on us, we're making them even better, and we're creating a world that future generations can thrive in.
Yeah, but so at the same time, I don't want to pretend that long-termism, or we shouldn't pretend that long-termism is just mundane and completely common sense. There is something that's more distinctive and a bit more controversial about it. Yeah, do you want to draw out that aspect of it?
For sure. I think the thing that's most distinctive is what we mean by long-term. The sheer scale of how we're thinking about things, where, people criticize current political thought for being short-termist, or companies for being short-termist. And what they mean is, companies are focused on the next quarter profits. Our political cycles are focused on the next election, and they should be thinking further out on the order of years or decades. But I think we should not be so myopic. In fact, we should take seriously the whole possible scale of the future of humanity. So one thing that we've just learned in the last 100 years of science is that there is a truly vast future in front of us, and it feels odd, possibly even grandiose, to start thinking about, well, what are the things that could happen in our lifetime that could have an impact, not just, over decades, but over centuries, thousands, millions, or even billions of years. But if we're taking seriously that future people matter morally, and that it really doesn't matter when harms or benefits occur, then we really should take seriously this question of whether there could be events that occur in our lifetimes that have not just long-lasting, but indefinitely persistent effects.
Okay, so that's the reason why, given that people will exist in the future, we should try to make their lives better. Do you want to say anything about the idea that it would be good to make there be more people in future, which is kind of one subset, I suppose, of the activities that people engage in to try to make the future better?
Yeah, so there are two ways you can positively influence the long-term future. You can increase the duration of civilization, so you can make sure we don't go extinct or civilization doesn't irrecoverably collapse. But you can also, and you can improve the quality of the future. So for however long civilization will last, you can make sure that the people who do live in that future have better lives. If you're looking at the first of those, so reducing the risk of extinction or catastrophe, then you get into this question of, okay, you're not actually benefiting future people, you're just enabling future generations to exist. And even if you think they've got very good lives, you might think, well, it's not really a moral loss if they don't exist. And I think there's something intuitive about that view, but I think ultimately it's not correct. And that's for a few arguments, some of which get technical. I talk about it in the book. One way of thinking about it is just to imagine lives with intense suffering. So if you could bring into existence a life that lasts 10 years and just has the most tortured, extreme suffering, and you have the option of not bringing into existence that life, seems pretty clear that you ought to just say no, a life full of suffering just shouldn't be lived.
Yeah.
And in fact, that would be just a harm for the person whose life you'd bring into existence. So if we think that about lives that are negative, that have so much more, that have more suffering than happiness, well, why should we not think symmetrically like the same? So perhaps, and this becomes more intuitive if you think about really, really good lives. Just imagine your best day. And then imagine you could create a life that was just every day is just as good as that. And they just have this wonderful, flourishing life. Then it becomes more intuitive. Actually, it is just a loss if that person doesn't get to live and experience this world.
Yeah. I guess, population ethics, which is kind of the philosophy of what you're just talking about, is a huge area in itself that we probably won't be able to dive into very much today, but we can stick up a link to, I guess, the best summary that we can find on that in the show notes.
For sure, yeah. And I should say it's one of the hardest and most complex and challenging areas of moral philosophy. And I have a chapter on this, chapter 8, I think, in the book, and it kind of is the best overview I could do, at least.
Okay. Okay, so the third plank in the argument is that we actually can do something to help people in the future. Yeah, do you want to explain why you think this issue is tractable, as we say?
Yeah, I think there are two ways in which we can impact the long-term future. First is we can ensure that we have a future at all by reducing risks to the extinction of human beings or to the collapse of civilization. And a second is that we can help ensure that the values and ideas that guide future society are better ones rather than worse.
Okay, so we've got avoiding extinction, which is pretty intuitive that would have persistent impacts. And then there's trying to change what people opt to do, what activities they're engaged in the future, I guess you're saying by shifting the values that they have, so the things that they think are valuable to do. And I suppose it's a little bit counterintuitive that we might be able to affect what people care about thousands of years in the future. But I guess as we'll come back to later, actually the case for that is almost overwhelming that is possible. I guess, is it only values that are the ways of shifting what people do in future? Or is there also changing people's practices or some other way of shifting what people are up to in future?
There are some other things I think we can do. So preserving information, preserving species, digitizing things, preserving internet archive backups. Yeah. I think those have a very mild benefit just forever, because I think information can persist forever. There are also sometimes arguments about more kind of economic or technological lock-in. So QWERTY keyboards versus Dvorak keyboards is this it's this paradigm example, allegedly, of lock-in, where a certain standard was chosen and just persisted for a long time.
And arguably it's way worse, but hard to shift now.
Exactly. From my investigation, I found approximately 0 examples of plausible technological lock-in. And then I think when we're looking over, so the QWERTY versus Dvorak, there's not good arguments that Dvorak is really superior to QWERTY. The arguments that you've heard came from Dvorak himself.
I see, really? Okay.
He was a good, self-publicist. And then when we're thinking, okay, not just a century, let's say, but, millions of years into the future, and then we ask, why does future civilization not switch to some better standard? Seems pretty hard.
Just because they won't be in a hurry at that point. Things will, at some point, things will stable out.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, imagine if, in your own case, if you were going to be a typist for 1 million years, you'd really invest the time in, setting up your keyboard in the way that makes most sense.
Yeah, makes sense. So far we've been talking at a pretty abstract level. It might help people to think about long-termism if they have kind of a more concrete idea in mind of what it actually implies, of what long-termists are actually doing. Do you have a couple of useful illustrative examples of that to hand?
For sure. So one focus area is pandemic prevention, but in particular from worst-case pandemics. You might think, this is a very trendy thing to be hopping on the bandwagon of, but we have been concerned about this for many, many years. I think 80,000 Hours started recommending this as a career area in 2014, I believe. And why are we so concerned about this? Well, developments in synthetic biology could enable the creation of pathogens with unprecedented destructive power, such that, the COVID-19 pandemic, while killing tens of millions of people, wreaking trillions of dollars of damage, being an enormous tragedy, it would make that tragedy look kind of small scale. And in fact, in the limit, we could create pathogens that could kill literally everyone on the planet. And if the human race goes extinct, that's a persistent effect. We're not coming back from that.
Yeah.
So what are we doing? Well, I think there's various possible options. So one thing we're doing is investing in technology that can be used to prevent against worst-case pandemics. So something I'm particularly excited about at the moment is far UVC. This is quite a narrow spectrum of light. You can have comparatively high energy light in the spectrum, and it completely, the hope is that it basically sterilizes rooms that the light is shining on. This is, because it's a kind of physical means of sterilizing surfaces, and even sterilizing air, if it really works, it's protective against a very wide array of pathogens. It's not necessarily something that, clever and malintentioned biologists could kind of guard against. But yet, if this were implanted as standard in all light bulbs around the world, then potentially we could just actually be protected against all pandemics ever, as well as all respiratory diseases, just as a bonus.
Yeah, right.
So, this is very early stage. We're going to fund this a lot, but potentially at least extremely exciting.
Yeah. What's another example?
So another example within pandemic preparedness would be early detection, where at the moment we do very little for screening for novel pathogens, but you could imagine a program that just all around the world is constantly screening wastewater, for example, to see, is there anything in these samples that we just don't know about that looks like a new virus or a new bacterial infection? And then can ring the alarm bell means we could respond much, much faster to some new pandemic outbreak.
Yeah. Any non-pandemic stuff?
So there's lots. But the other big focus by far is on artificial intelligence, where I think there are good arguments that the development of artificial intelligence that's not just narrow, so we already use AI all the time when we're using Google search, let's say, but AI that is more advanced, more able to do a very wide array of tasks, and able to act basically like an agent, like an actor in the world in the way that humans do. There's arguments for thinking that could be among the most important inventions ever, and really pivotal for the long-run trajectory of civilization. And that's kind of for two reasons. One is that technological progress could go much, much faster. So if, at the moment, why is technological progress, why does it go at the pace it does? Well, there's just only so much kind of human research labor that can go onto it, and that takes time. Well, what if we automate that? What if now it's AI is doing R&D? There's no reason in principle, and in fact, economic models produce the result that technological progress could go much, much faster. So in our lifetimes, perhaps actually it's the equivalent of thousands of years of technological advancement that are happening.
Yeah, I suppose it could be thousands of years, but even if it was just decades occurring in a single year, that would still be massive.
That would still be absolutely massive.
And I guess we'll be going into this process kind of not knowing how much it's going to speed things up, which is pretty unnerving.
Which is pretty unnerving, exactly. And so it could lead to enormous concentrations of power, perhaps with a single company, a single country, or the AI systems themselves. And so this is the scenario kind of normally referred to as the Terminator scenario. Many researchers don't like that. I think we should own it.
It's a good movie.
It's a good movie. The time travel is maybe unrealistic, but other elements actually do map onto the worries, where the thought is you've got very rapid technological progress happening. That's being driven by the AIs themselves. The AI systems are acting as agents in the world and actors. They are not bottlenecked in terms of the peaks of the intelligence that they can reach in the way that we are, where, well, there's only so much brain you can fit inside a human skull. Whereas AIs could have more and more computational power, computational power that they're using, better and better software. And so it might not be a very long time period at all that these AI actors move from being about human level intelligence to being much, much smarter than we are. And we might find ourselves in a situation where it's really AI systems that are controlling the future rather than human beings. And that seems like a pivotal moment because we might ask, well, what do those AI systems care about? What are they aiming to do?
Yeah.
It could be they're benevolent and they work together with humans and we all together build this like flourishing future society. It could be that they care about things that are just very alien to us and that perhaps have no moral value at all. And humanity is left entirely disempowered.
Yeah.
And the future just gets driven by things that just might seem kind of arbitrary to us. And that could just be this indefinite loss of value.
So, yeah, that's a lot of concreteness there. I guess if you're about to stop listening, then don't walk away thinking that long-termism is synonymous with preventing pandemics and worrying about AI, because I guess the long-termist mentality can go in all kinds of different directions, and we'll come back to some other possible applicate or like concrete ways of cashing out the ideas later on. But let's come back to the kind of abstract philosophy for a little bit longer. I guess something that might not be totally obvious to people until they read your book anyway, is that you actually took quite a long time to come around to being bought into long-termism, at least on a kind of emotional level, or being motivated by the ideas. Yeah, what were your reservations when you first heard about the idea?
Yeah, and it wasn't just emotional disinclination. Intellectually, I wasn't bought in for quite a while. In fact, the first time I met Toby, and he presented to me the idea of Giving What We Can, which we later co-founded.
Yeah, Toby Ord.
Toby Ord, of course. I asked him, what are your biggest worries about this project, the ways in which you think it could be fundamentally mistaken? And he said among his biggest worries were that perhaps focusing on global health and development wasn't the right thing to do. Instead, we should focus on existential risks. That is, risks that could dramatically reduce humanity's long-term potential, such as catastrophic pandemics, catastrophic AI. And I thought this was crackpot. I thought this was totally crackpot at the time. In terms of my intellectual development, maybe over the course of 3 to 6 months, I moved to thinking it was non-crackpot.
Yeah.
And then over the course of a number of years, became intellectually bought in. When I wrote Doing Good Better, so I first met Toby Ord in 2009. When I wrote Doing Good Better, I did seriously consider including, I have some material on global catastrophic risks in there. I considered having much more, but decided I didn't want to kind of make the book too broad, too diffuse. And then it was by 2017 that I really thought, look, I just want to really pivot to focusing on these issues.
Why did you initially think it was crackpot? I guess this is 2009, so it was a weirder idea at that point. Far fewer people were into it, but...
So 2009, it just was a lot more crackpot then. In two senses. One was just very few people were into this idea. Second is that the particular activities that were being discussed were much more speculative now. So one thing that's striking is actually the correlation between the biggest risks that were identified at that point, almost from the armchair, and what we now regard as the biggest risks, where AI was regarded as a very major risk, pathogens were regarded as a very major risk. The most notable difference is that nanotech was regarded as a very major risk, and
it's kind of dropped off the radar.
Dropped off the radar. People don't really see it as pivotal now. Having said that, what do we do about such things? That was much, much less well developed. I certainly could not have told you about far UVC or early detection programs in 2009. So it was much more like a bunch of people on the outskirts of academia or not in academia, kind of on blogs, really kind of speculating about such things.
Yeah, writing up their pet theories.
Exactly, that's right. And so why was I not intellectually convinced to begin with? I think there's two reasons. Firstly, I understood existential risks as just extinction risks, and that being the main pathway. And the focus for thinking that extinction risk is enormously important from a very long-term perspective, it does rely on some philosophical assumptions, in particular population ethics assumptions, that the loss of a future life, even if very good, is a moral loss, in the sense of a loss of a future life, of that life never existing in the first place, not in the sense of someone dying. And then a second is the future being net positive, which I guess I have just always thought, but at least, it's another question mark that you could have. And then thirdly, just even if you accept that the very long-term future is of enormous importance, it's where almost all value is the best way to promote that value by reducing extinction risk? Well, what about speeding up economic growth? Both in terms of, that's also increasing more value in the future, and also just on a practical perspective, the fact that reducing extinction risk, even if you think that's where kind of the pathway to increasing future value, doesn't mean you should work on that directly. Maybe we're just unsure enough about how to reduce extinction risk that doing much broader things like generally making the world better is the best thing to do.
Yeah. Something that's a little bit funny about this is I've gone back and been looking at some old books that discussed existential risks or global catastrophic risks. There was in 2003 the famous lawyer and jurist Richard Posner wrote this book called Catastrophe: Risk and Response, which I think just lays out this incredibly boring common sense case that humanity is vulnerable to big disruptions and we're not really doing very much about that. We don't really dedicate any people to thinking about that or preventing that, and there's stuff that could be done. It's kind of a lot more common sense in flavor and kind of embedded within mainstream academic discussion than the existential risk stuff was in 2009. And I almost think it's a real shame that there was, well, I guess, I don't know, who knows? Maybe if we'd stuck with the kind of the common sense argument, that would have closed our mind to more interesting things. But I wonder whether, in fact, this whole process was slowed down by not just adopting a more boring, economics, cost-benefit analysis way of talking about existential risks.
I think that's very possible. Certainly the early discussion of this, it had a feeling of kind of fringiness to it that wasn't helpful and wasn't really necessary as well. I should say with that book, Catastrophe, Risk and Response, it's focused on catastrophes where that could mean 10% of the population dying or 90%, which are distinct from the category of existential risks and distinct from long-termism, where Posner endorses a discount rate such that the long-term future does not have enormous moral value. Past a few centuries, it loses almost all its value because you reduce on his model, you decrease the value of the future every year by 2% or so in terms of even welfare. And that means after a few hundred years that
you just don't care.
You just don't care, exactly. And that's how he gets around the conclusion that extinction risk should be a particular focus. And how big a difference does this make in practice is not hugely obvious, but at least in terms of conceptual understanding, I think it's very important. There's a very important difference between what Richard Posner was doing and what the people working on existential risk were doing.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so coming back to your gradual journey towards being excited by long-termism, did you find it intuitive to care about future generations to quite the degree that, I guess, supporters like Toby Ord was suggesting in 2009?
So I certainly found it intuitive to care about future generations. I think it was very open as a question to me, the best way of doing that. In particular, I think I would have endorsed the idea that, well, maybe there are these things that have very long-lasting effects, but, who knows if we can really make any traction on them. Perhaps just the best thing you can do, even for the long term, is building a flourishing society, increasing economic growth.
Improving education,
making
democracy work better, yeah.
But then the biggest thing was just looking at, what are the options I have available to me in terms of what do I focus my time on? Where one is building up this idea of giving what we can, of, a kind of model movement focused on helping people and using evidence and data to do that. And it just seemed like we were getting a lot of traction there. Alternatively, and I did go, spend these 5-hour seminars at Future of Humanity Institute that were talking about, the impacts of superintelligence. Seemed like, actually, one way in which I was wrong is just the impact of the book that turned into, namely Superintelligence, was maybe 100 times more impactful than...
Oh, wow.
I mean, Superintelligence has sold 200,000 copies.
Okay,
Again, if you'd asked me how many copies I expected it to sell, maybe I'd have said 1,000 or 2,000.
Right.
So the impact of it actually was much greater than I was thinking at the time. But I think I just think I was right that the tractability of what we were working on at the time was pretty low. And doing this thing of just building a movement of people who really care about some of the problems in the world and who are trying to think carefully about how to make progress there was just much better than being this additional person in the seminar room. I honestly think that intuition was correct. And that was true for Toby as well. Early days of Giving What We Can, he'd be having these arguments with people in Less Long about whether it was right to focus on global health and development. And his view was well, we're actually doing something.
You guys just comment on this forum.
Yeah. And again, looking back, actually, again, I will say I've been surprised by just how influential some of these ideas have been. And that's a tremendous testament to early thinkers like Nick Bostrom and Eliezer Yudkowsky and Carl Schulman. At the same time, I think the insight that we had, which was, we've actually just got to build stuff.
Yeah.
And even if perhaps there are some theoretical arguments that you should prioritizing in a different way, there are many, many positive indirect effects from just doing something impressive and concrete and tangible, as well as the enormous benefits that we have succeeded in producing, which is tens to hundreds of millions of bed nets distributed and thousands of lives saved.
Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of the setup for how there was a decent degree of resistance to long-termism when you first encountered it. Yeah, what was one of the first steps that you took towards embracing it on a deeper level?
So intellectually, the two big differences. So the first was just starting to appreciate the scale of the future. And that came pretty early on. So the arguments, I think, that the future, in expectation, where that's a bit of technical terminology, means just once you take into account both probabilities and scale into account. So, life expectancy is like this. If you've got a 10% chance of living 100 more years, that would increase your life expectancy by 10 years.
Yeah.
But in expectation, the future is very big indeed. That yes, perhaps we'll go extinct in the next few centuries, but if we don't, and we get to a kind of safe place, things could be really big indeed. As I say, hundreds of millions of years until the Earth is no longer habitable, hundreds of trillions of years till the last stars fade. So the idea that there's just this enormous amount of kind of moral value there, in fact, if whatever you care about, essentially, whether that's, joy, adventure, achievement, the natural environment, it's almost all in the future.
Yeah.
That I had I got bought into fairly early on. And then the two things that really changed were firstly, the philosophical arguments becoming just more robust over time, I think. So I think that the issue of population ethics, for example, where that's questions about, is it a moral loss if we fail to create someone at a future date who would have a happy, flourishing life? That's actually essentially irrelevant to the case for long-termism, because I think there are things that we can do that aren't just about increasing the number of people in the future, but about how well or badly the future goes, given that the future is long.
I see.
So the difference between a flourishing utopian future and one of just perpetual dictatorship.
Yeah. Okay, so it might affect where you focus, whether you focus on there being creating a future that has way more people in it versus not. But even if you weren't bought in on there being more people, because there will probably be tons of people, or at least an expectation there'll be lots of people in the future, then you'd still care about the long-term impacts because you'd want to improve their quality of life and leave them in a better situation.
For sure, exactly. So that's one. Secondly, I think getting more clarity on the arguments why economic growth, for example, is not, at least not directly, a way of positively influencing the very long-term future, because at some point in time we will plateau. So perhaps you speed up a little bit the point at which we get as well off technologically as we ever will. But that's, something that we will achieve over the course of, could be not that long, but certainly thousands of years.
Yeah.
That's not something that's affecting the really long-run trajectory of civilization. Whereas actually the things that do affect it are perhaps a much narrower set of activities, such as AI and pandemic prevention. But then the second category of things was less philosophical and more empirical, where the sorts of actions that one would recommend as a long-termist moved out of the category of let's sit and think more about this in a philosophy seminar room or something equivalent, where there's just a real worry that's like, are we really achieving anything here? And instead are now just like very concrete. So within AI, there's this huge boom in machine learning research. We are now able to like experiment with models to see, do they display deceptive behavior? Can we make them more truthful? Can we make them less likely to cause harm? In the case of pandemics, like we have...
We've learned a lot.
We've learned a lot over the last few years. We have like very concrete ways of making progress. And so the actions that we now recommend have really moved out of something where it feels very brittle, it feels very like we could easily be fooling ourselves, and more to just, look, it's just this list of things that we can really get traction on.
Yeah. It's very interesting that you're a philosopher by training, and in 2009 you were already, were you doing your philosophy PhD then? Or
I was doing my master's degree, so just before my PhD.
Just before that, yeah. But even given that, if you're in a philosophy seminar room where people are talking about really big, important, potentially like crucially decisive ideas that might affect what you should do, if there's no actual way of cashing it out, if there's no project that seems tractable and viable to build, then kind of no matter how important the ideas seem on paper, you have this intuition that you want to hit the eject button basically and say, I'm not going to let this blackboard philosophy determine my direction. And you almost insist that until there's something practical, I'm just going to refuse to engage with this on this level.
For sure. And this is actually something that I think is great about the intersection between academic research and the effective altruism movement, is that it's extremely easy for academic research or similar to just get lost in the weeds of some intellectual project that actually just doesn't cash out, even if it feels like it's very practical. So philosophy engages a lot with the question of the value of equality and inequality, disvalue of inequality. And there's various different models of how should you take into account the value of equality. At the time, this really felt like a very important thing. It actually really does influence economists to some extent. But actually, I think it basically doesn't make any difference, because look at the world, the scale of inequality is just so vast that whether you're simply adding up benefits to people or whether you give extra value also to people being, less well off than others, that is, you give weight to inequality, the disvalue of inequality itself, just doesn't make any difference for practical purposes.
Yeah.
And so that's a case where it's something that seems like it's going to be practical, but practically relevant does not become practically relevant.
Yeah, I guess economists would say it's practically relevant, but not on the margin.
Yes,
so it's like with the case where with spending to reduce global catastrophic risks. If you're having a debate about whether you should increase spending by 30-fold or 70-fold, on some level that is a practical question. On another level, you could just say, well, let's just start by doubling it.
Exactly.
And then we could discuss this more.
And this is one of the things that I think most often gets misunderstood about effective altruism, is that we're always thinking on the margin. And so, if I'm going around championing a very long-term perspective, so greater investment in pandemic preparedness and AI safety and AI governance, that's saying relative to where we are now, we should be spending and focusing a lot more on this. Whereas people might respond and say, oh, are you saying that all of our resources should be spent on this? I'm like, no. I really don't know the point at which the arguments for long-termism just stop working because we've just used up all of the best targeted opportunities for making the long term go well, and such that there's just no difference. Yeah, exactly. There's just no difference between a long-termist argument and just an argument that's about building a flourishing society in general.
Yeah.
Maybe you hit that 50%, maybe it's 10%, maybe it's even 1%. I don't really know. But given what the world currently prioritizes, should we care more about our grandkids and their grandkids and, how the course of the next few millennia and millions of years go? Yes.
Yeah.
and that's the claim. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Coming back to your like gradual persuasion, what sort of time scale are we talking about here? I mean, so in 2009, you first kind of learned about it, and it sounds like you gradually you came to think it's not crazy. But in 2014, you wrote "Doing Good Better," and that somewhat soft pedals long-termism when you're introducing effective altruism. So it seems like it was quite a long time before you got fully bought in.
Yeah. I mean, I think I should say for 2014, writing "Doing Good Better," in some sense, the most accurate book that was fully representing kind of my and colleagues like EA thought would have been broader than the particular focus. And especially for my first book, there was a lot of kind of equivalent of trade. It's like an agreement with the publishers about like what gets included.
I see.
I also wanted to include a lot more than animal issues, but the publishers really didn't. They really didn't like that, actually. So their thought was, you just don't want to make it too weird.
I see. Okay.
So
they want to sell books, and they were keep it fairly mainstream.
Exactly. There was and there was also just a thought of like start talking about the issues about existential risk at more length. Like again, it's not that clear like what you tell people to do. Having said that, 2014, I think I would have just presented all of global health and development, animal welfare, and existential risk work, kind of on like a even kind of playing field, as it were.
Yeah.
And then it was after then the kind of wave of publication of that and, increase in the uptake of the effective altruism kind of movement. I felt like, okay, that project has now been kind of wrapped up. And so now I want to focus kind of in a much more deliberate way on these kind of long-termist issues. I remember 2017 in particular, because that felt like I was at a bit of a moment where I'd wrapped up some projects. It was also a moment of particularly energetic discussion about AI timelines,
right?
Where the AlphaGo had that appeared in 2016. Then some people started making arguments in 2017 for very short AI timelines.
As in, we might have human-level AI within years or something?
Yeah, so there were a couple of people who were arguing for 5-year timelines, as in like 50-50 chance of human-level intelligence within 5 years.
Yeah. Bold prediction.
You might notice that was exactly 5 years ago. So one pathway into the book was that these were people I respected a lot. So I thought like, I'm going to like dive into this a bit more. Started diving into it. I was not particularly convinced of the kind of ultra-short AI timelines arguments. That led to like pulling on a bunch of other threads. And I thought, okay, I just actually really want to figure this all out for myself. And then I guess 5 years later, I've now got this book.
What we got in the future.
What we got in the future.
Yeah. So that's some of the areas where you've kind of come around to the long-termist perspective. What still kind of feel like the strongest arguments against, the long term being a key moral priority that still seem kind of plausible to you?
I think there are a few. So one, maybe the most powerful, but not that action relevant, is just maybe nothing matters. So maybe the world is just entirely meaningless, and for any time you say we should do something, that's just false.
Yeah, okay. It's a misunderstanding, yeah.
Yeah, because nihilism is true.
Yeah, okay, well, let's bracket that.
We can bracket that. The one that I think is really weighs on me most is just the following argument, which is, look over kind of our intellectual progress in the last few hundred years. There's a series of just enormous kind of intellectual changes, Nick Bostrom would call crucial considerations, that greatly change how we should think about our top priorities. So probability theory was only developed in the 17th century by Blaise Pascal, even in its very early stages. The idea that the future might be enormously large and the universe might be enormously big, but yet unpopulated. That was just only the early 20th century. The idea of AI actually has a pretty decent history going, the first computer science pioneers, Alan Turing and I.J. Good, basically just understood the risks that AI posed.
Seemingly almost immediately.
It was incredible. I mean, they were very smart people, I think.
That's true, yeah.
I mean, they don't have the arguments like really well worked out, and I think a lot of intellectual contribution comes from, really going deep. But you look at the quotes from Turing and I.J. Good in the 50s and early 60s, and it does seem like they're getting some of the key issues. The idea that, artificial beings could be much smarter than us, and that there's a question of kind of what goals do we give them. Also the idea that they're immortal, because any AI system can just replicate itself indefinitely.
Yeah. And the positive feedback loop, right, really jumped out of them. They're like, oh, you make these smart machines, then they can improve themselves better than we could, and so it could like take off.
Exactly. That was, I.J. Good stated that just very cleanly. Pandemics as well. So the first ever piece of dystopian science fiction was by Mary Shelley called The Last Man, and that was in the 19th century, and that was about a pandemic that killed everyone in the world. So actually, there is a good track record of some people being strikingly prophetic. Having said that, it was still only in the 80s that population ethics really became a field. Nick Bostrom's astronomical waste argument was in the 2000s. I honestly still feel like we're learning a lot in terms of, nanotech was still like one of the top causes in 2010.
Yeah.
And then I honestly feel like we're learning a lot in terms of what the right ways, even if the priorities aren't changing, like biorisk or AI, we're learning a lot about, how best to tackle them. So I think we're still learning a lot. In 100 years' time, might there be very, major crucial considerations such that we would look back at us today and think, oh, they were really getting some major things wrong, in the same way as that we would look back at people in the 19th century saying like, oh, wow, they really misunderstood. So actually, I have an example.
Yeah.
The early utilitarians, John Stuart Mill and colleagues, they had this brief long-termist phase.
Really?
Yep. John Stuart Mill has this wonderful quote, speaking to Parliament, "You might ask, why should we care about posterity? After all, what has posterity ever done for us?" And then has this beautiful discussion of actually posterity has done lots of things for us, because we build projects, like life only has meaning because we are doing things for the benefit of posterity.
I see. Okay, so the thing that they're doing for us is holding all the value
exactly,
that we'll create. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But interestingly, the focus there is keeping coal in the ground. Because the thought at the time is that the reason Britain, and Britain in particular at the time, is so rich is because it's able to burn all this coal. And they have this extraordinarily low estimate of how much coal reserves there are.
Okay.
And so they think, wow, well, we need to keep coal in the ground so that future generations have
some energy.
Have some energy, yeah. So they've got like incredibly bad understanding of economics, incredibly bad understanding of coal reserves. And so it's a pretty good thing that they were not spending all of their time keeping coal in the ground for those reasons, at least.
It's even better than you're saying, because it seems like it would have been actively detrimental, perhaps, to us if they'd done the thing that they think would be good, because they just would have slowed down the Industrial Revolution and everything would have been set back, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and especially you might worry about climate change, but one thing to say is like the amount of fossil fuels you're burning in the end of the 19th century is just basically tiny compared to the amount we're burning now. I think it's a very strong argument that the economic benefits are outweighing the climate change effect at that point in time.
Sure.
So yeah, in fact, it would have been, I think you're right, I think it would have been actively harmful. Now, might the people in 100 years' time look at us and be like, oh, whoa, they thought that AI was the thing to focus on, pandemics, like... I think the idea that we're like sufficiently confused that our actions are doing harm, again, possibly with AI as well, where it's like focus on the power of AI and therefore... perhaps that speeds up development of it through space dynamics. Yeah, so the thought here is just there's a very different perspective that one could take on how we should be taking action. And I call that robust effective altruism.
I see.
So we've got long-termist effective altruism, which is, focus on the long-term future as a key moral priority of our time. Robust effective altruism is a little bit different, though it might be very overlapping, where instead you're trying to do things that just, even if on a naive benefit-cost calculus, do not look like the optimal thing. They look pretty good on a wide variety of perspectives.
You have a kind of clean energy as an example of this, right?
Yeah, so clean energy I just think of as like weirdly robustly good.
Yeah.
Where it makes sense. Like most things, it's just, there are arguments on either side, and like, okay, I think it is good, but like maybe it could be bad. Whereas clean tech, in the book I describe it as a win-win-win-win-win. But I actually think I missed out a win. I think it's like 6 wins.
Okay. I don't want to talk about this for too long, so maybe just list them quickly. Yeah.
So very briefly, very near term, particulates from fossil fuels kill about 3.5 million people a year.
Yeah.
It's just really bad. And this is like this enormous non-internalized externality. And there's a strong case for just getting off fossil fuels as quickly as possible, just for those reasons.
Yeah. I think economists think that it would pay for itself, speeding up the transition away from fossil fuels a lot would pay for itself just through the health gains. At least in rich countries, it would be well worth it.
Yeah, for sure. sounds plausible. I mean, even in the EU, we lose about a year of life expectancy just from the particulates from fossil fuels. Okay, so that's one. A second, of course, is climate change, which will be very familiar. A third is that clean technology, investment in innovation, it speeds up technological progress. I think that's a good thing for many reasons, but including to avoid the chance of very long-term stagnation, which we might talk about later in this podcast. A fourth is it reduces energy poverty in poor countries. So it's also making poor countries richer there. Then we get to some somewhat more esoteric reasons. But a fifth is just that it helps keep coal in the ground, and we might need it for future generations. So that's John Stuart Mill coming back again. But in particular, I mean, we've got a lot of fossil fuels remaining. So if you imagine there was some catastrophe, humanity gets sent back to agricultural level technology, and we have to rebuild again. Well, they couldn't rely on easily accessible oil because we've used up almost all of it. But they would have about, at current levels of consumption, about 300 years worth of coal. If, however, there were a catastrophe and we had to rebuild to current levels, we would use up all of those fossil fuels again. So it's kind of like we have one life remaining.
Okay. Like in Super Mario, I guess.
Like in Super Mario, exactly. And so if we were to have a second catastrophe, then we would have to rebuild civilization without relying on fossil fuels. Which I think, again, we probably could do.
Probably, yeah.
People in general are very innovative. They're very strong incentives for economic growth. But I think it would be harder. That's the one thing that most gives me pause when I'm thinking about recovery after collapse. And so this is another reason. Again, I should be clear, I'm not talking at all about the magnitudes of any of these. I'm just talking about the sign.
Yeah. And then what do you have on the other side? Oh,
okay.
Did you have a sixth one?
The sixth one is then if you think about distribution of values in the world. So if you think about what are the countries that are authoritarian or even leaning dictatorial, where some really kind of toxic ideologies can persist, pretty strong correlation between those cultures or countries and countries where leadership can take power and literally fuel themselves, like pay for themselves indefinitely by extracting natural resources and selling them. And they don't have to be responsive to the public. So it's familiar in economics, this idea of a resource curse, that at least in Africa, actually having a lot of natural resources, namely fossil fuels, seems to be a bad thing because it gave an incentive for dictators. Similarly, the fact that Russia is able to persist as this oligopoly is because one economist describes it as a gas station with a military. Yeah. Whereas if you've got, if you're relying economically on the innovation that's being produced by your people, it's like much harder to be kind of authoritarian.
Yeah. Well, I suppose you have a strong incentive to educate people and make sure that the population broadly is flourishing and the power is widely distributed, which tends to lead to a different set, and hopefully a more humane set of values. Okay, and then I guess the other thing with clean energy is that then you try to be, well, what's on the other side? Like, what are the risks here? How could it go wrong? And it's just kind of tumbleweed, I guess. Yeah, for sure. I mean, the strongest case would be if you thought that economic development in general is bad, which I don't. Like, I think... and bad, even if it's driven by solar panels. Yeah. I know, exactly. I'm like... I'm really like, solar panels, like enhanced geothermal. I mean, I'm just... really struggling to see that as like a really big risk to the world. Yeah. But there is one line of argument you could make, which I think doesn't ultimately cash out, which is, look, we're going really fast technologically. Our kind of societal wisdom is not going fast enough. If economic growth technological growth was just in general going slower, there would be more time for kind of moral reasoning and political development to kind of catch up. And so actually we just want a slower growth rate over the coming centuries. And I think that's not true, but that's the one argument you could make against it. Yeah. Yeah, do you want to elaborate a bit more on, I guess, robust effective altruism versus, what's the alternative? What do we call that? I was contrasting it with long-termist effective altruism, although really the two things are overlapping because, you might want to do robustly good actions because you think long-termism is true, you're just not sure like what the best ways of promoting long-term value. But you also might want to do robustly good actions because maybe long-termism isn't true. So I do think they're distinct ways of viewing the world and what we should prioritize. Yeah. Okay, so that was an example of robust effective altruism. Yeah, do you have any others that stand out? Yeah, many. So another one, I think, is just reducing the risk of war. And I think war is really bad. It's something that would have been accessible for basically all of history. If you look at the Moists, for example, who are kind of like
very early effective altruists, at least there's some notable similarities where they had a broadly consequentialist moral philosophy. They were a kind of influential philosophy in the period of 100 schools of thought, about 500 BC in ancient China. So, kind of somewhat intellectually similar. And their view was like, oh, yeah, war is the worst thing. We need to stop war. And so they became very good at defensive warfare.
Yeah, they got really good at building walls around cities so that attackers wouldn't even think it was worth their while to have a go.
Yeah, exactly. And they actually formed, it's amazing, a group of altruists, and they would wear kind of rags because they didn't want to spend money on luxuries. Yeah. And they formed a paramilitary group in order to defend cities that were under siege.
New org idea.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's the when we're talking about concrete implementations. So I think it's very accessible. And, later when we talk more about some of the risks we face, like risks from worst-case pandemics via, artificial pathogens, risks from people just being really dumb when it comes to developing AI and, going too fast, being in an arms race dynamic, risks from, some single country trying to take over the world and implement a dictatorship, all of the risks from unknowns as well. All of these things look much worse, in my view, in either a hot or cold war scenario.
Okay, yeah.
And I think there's just a plausible explanation for that, which is that people start doing really dumb things.
Or these reckless things.
Yeah, reckless things, exactly, in a war scenario. It's also very strongly negative sum. So if you think people's goals in general are broadly good, then the fact that we're in this world of trade, where, in general, countries are cooperating, at least at the moment, that's way better than this aggressive competitive scenario. So I think even for things I haven't really figured out, reducing the risk of war looks pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah, a really nice example of that has come up on the show once or twice before is the Manhattan Project, when obviously the US was fighting the Nazis, fighting the Japanese. Some of the physicists thought they thought about this a bunch, they did some modeling, and they were like, we're pretty sure that a nuclear blast won't ignite the atmosphere, but we're not totally sure about it. And they went ahead and definitely tested out the nuclear bomb anyway. If they hadn't been at war, they might have pressed pause on that and thought a little bit longer about whether they wanted to take a 1 in 100 chance of killing everyone.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, perhaps even from their perspective, they were right to do so. Because the risk was, attempted world domination by the Nazis. Yeah. So exactly, that's not the sort of thing that one does in peacetime. Exactly. Yeah. It's just far more reckless. And then a final set of things is just trying to generally build a community and movement of people who are morally motivated, care a lot about the truth, just want to have true beliefs, are cooperative and willing to respond to new evidence as it comes in. And so I think the growth of kind of effective altruism as an idea in a community, as long as we can preserve those virtues, also looks kind of good and robustly good across a wide array of scenarios. Because, 20 years' time, Rob Wiblin Jr. comes up with some amazing kind of insight.
Much better than the trash that we could think of.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Some incredible, we've really got to just update our views. Well, if you've built a community that is capable of updating in that way, changing its mind in light of good arguments or evidence, then great, we've built these resources, we've given those resources to people who are morally motivated and smarter and better informed than us, and then they take action on the right things. Yeah.
Okay, so you've written a book about effective altruism, as well as now a book about long-termism. What is the relationship between these ideas, if anything? Does effective altruism imply long-termism, or long-termism imply effective altruism, or are these just kind of, logically independent ideas that you can accept and reject as you like?
For long-termism, I think they're separate ideas. So obviously many people in effective altruism are not long-termists. They focus on near-term issues. There are a number of people who we could consider long-termists who are not part of the effective altruism community. So the Long Now Foundation is like that.
So the Long Now Foundation, I guess they don't really associate themselves, they don't identify, I guess, as part of effective altruism. But wouldn't we say maybe that the reason why they're doing it is actually effective altruist flavored reasons, whether they see it that way or not?
Well, I think whether they see it that way or not is kind of crucial. So it might be that they think the work they're doing is just the best thing they know of as a way of doing good, in which case they're effective altruists, even if they don't know it. It might be just that they thought this stuff was cool and they want to promote discussion of the long term, but they're not particularly making a claim that this is the best way of doing good.
Okay, I see. Okay, so someone who was interested in improving the long term but wasn't claiming that this was the best way for them to do good, or among the very best ways for them to do good, would count as someone who's embracing long-termism as a practice without being an EA. Yeah?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so that has been an introduction to, I guess, the arguments, the reasons why people might take long-termism seriously as a theory, as well as some of the potential weaknesses with it. And we'll talk more about the weaknesses later on. Let's now push on to maybe fleshing out a little bit more these two approaches that you've mentioned, or these two different kind of schools of thought within long-termism about how one can potentially have impacts that are very persistent. I suppose the setup here is that it's kind of counterintuitive, the idea that you could have impacts over millions of years. And many people do have the intuition that kind of anything we do now, well, sure, it might help someone today, but in the long term, it's all just going to wash out. And so you need some special theory for why any actions you're going to take now won't just wash out as society returns to some long-run trend that it would have gotten to regardless of what you did. And of course, the first approach that stands out is preventing extinction, because there's just like such a clear case that if all of the humans disappeared, then we're not going to be able to return to some previous trend. That is kind of maybe there'll be some future species on Earth, kind of the Planet of the Apes style, but most plausibly, there just isn't going to be a species like humans on Earth again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then the second one, which is perhaps a more emerging, like more modern school of thought within long-termism, is this idea of kind of changing the trajectory that we're on without changing whether we go extinct or not. So humans are going to be around, but maybe we could improve what people will decide to do in the future. So this is more about improving the quality of society or the quality of lives that will exist in future.
That's right. With one caveat that I think we should focus on this, whether or not humans are around. Possibly, I think most people, when they think about, the very long-term future, suspect that human beings, in the sense of like flesh and blood human beings, might be only a very small proportion of future beings, and instead it's kind of digital beings, like whether they are our successors in some way, and, we feel good about those beings, or where there's been some hostile event where AI digital beings have kind of aggressively taken over control of the future.
I see. So I guess we could talk about humanity and its descendants, or...
Humanity and its descendants, or just civilization.
Okay, civilization. There's humanity broadly construed, which includes uploaded people and any other descendants that we might produce. Okay, so just on the first one, the extinction risk. We've had a lot of episodes on that over the years, including a couple that stand out, like episode 72 with Toby Ord, where he talks about his book, The Precipice, which is pretty focused on these extinction scenarios. And there's also, more recently, episode 112 with Carl Schulman, where he kind of makes the common sense case for focusing on the risk of extinction. So we're not going to go into that in quite as much detail because it's covered elsewhere. But one thing I wanted to bring up with you about this is recently, or at least like this year, I've seen a lot of people make the case that in their mind, the risk of humans going extinct during their lifetime, or at least like over the next 100 years, is so high, 10% or more, that one doesn't really need to give a damn about future generations in order to be really worried about that. If you think there's a 10% chance or a 20% or 30% chance that civilization is going to be wiped out during your lifetime, then obviously that is a massive emergency. And it's an emergency for you and people you know, not just because of some like philosophy argument about future generations. And those folks are maybe even worried that focusing on the long-termist philosophy is kind of a distraction. Maybe it undersells the case for worrying about extinction risk if the risk is so large, because it gets people thinking about whether they care about future generations, whereas really what they should be thinking is, I'm at great risk and everything that I care about is at great risk right now. Yeah. And so you might actually get more buy-in if you just point to the empirical case for why we're on really shaky ground right now. What do you make of this idea?
There's lots to say on that. One important thing to distinguish is between, is something a good thing to do and is it the best thing to do, where the core idea of effective altruism is that we want to focus on the very best thing. And I entirely buy that even if you're just concerned about what happens over the next century, reducing the risks of extinction and of other sorts of catastrophe, reducing the risk of misaligned AI takeover, are just extremely good things to do. And even concerned about the next century, society should be investing a lot more in making sure they don't happen. Effective altruism is about doing the best we can. And certainly on its face, it would seem extremely suspicious and surprising if the best thing we could do for the very, very long term is also the very best thing we can do for the very short term. And then secondly, I think that, at least given my own estimates of human extinction and risks from misaligned artificial intelligence and other sorts of risks, I don't think that they would be sufficiently justified as saying that the very best thing, if we're just looking at the next century, let's say, even though I would if we're thinking on much longer timescales. Over what timescales do you need in order to start to really shift your priorities? Maybe whether you're looking a million years out or 10 billion years out doesn't make a difference. I'm pretty on board with that.
Yeah.
But I think if we're really ruthlessly focused on, doing the best we can, then the fact that almost all value is in the future should, one would expect it to really make a difference. I also just think in practice it does really make a difference. And so a big underlying thing is just what do we see as the size of extinction risk, say within our lifetimes, where people you reference think that, that's by far the most likely way they're going to die is at the hands of a misaligned artificial intelligence. I think that's a real risk that we should take really seriously, but I think I'm more likely to die of cancer.
Yeah. But by a decent margin?
I think I've got about a 20% chance of dying of cancer.
Okay. Yeah.
Whereas, at least in the book, I put it at something like a 3% chance of misaligned AI takeover. And maybe conditional on misaligned takeover, I think 50-50 chance that involves literally killing human beings rather than just disempowering them.
Yeah. I suppose, yeah, and the other argument you might make is, well, if long-termism is true as a philosophical proposition, then it's important for people to know that, even if it's not relevant to this specific decision, because might have all sorts of other implications. We can't just ignore it.
For sure. So this again relates to the question of, maybe we're badly mistaken about certain things. I think there's an important role for people to go out and say, catastrophic risk from pandemics is way higher than probably you think. Or the risk from AI is way higher than you think. And other people have gone and done that, and I think that's just really excellent. But I think it's also important to just try and convey fundamentally what's going on, so that perhaps we get information that biorisk is much higher than we thought, or AI's risk is higher or lower than we thought, or there's some new cause area that's even more important, or perhaps we should do very different things. Perhaps the actions you take if you're concerned about very worst case pandemics, the sort of thing that could really kill us all. Perhaps there's a very different set of actions than just pandemics that could kill 90% of people. I think just in general, people really understanding what the goals are, what we're aiming towards, that's just going to produce a better outcome, rather than kind of telling people adopt this particular policy, but they don't really understand a particular path of action, but they don't understand the ultimate goals. Because then if the environment changes or our information changes, people are doing wrong things.
Okay, so let's move on from extinction and talk about the second approach, which is trying to make sure that humanity does something really good, conditional on it surviving. Now, yeah, as I said, you might think that if humanity survives for a really long time, then we're going to just converge on the same values and the same activities no matter what, because we'll just think about it a lot. And yeah, no matter your intellectual starting point, ultimately the right arguments are going to win out. What do you think of that idea?
I think it's something we should be open to at least. But one way in which I differ from certain other people who work on long-termism is that I put a lot less weight on that. I'm in that sense a lot less optimistic, where I think it might be very hard for society to figure out what the correct thing to do is. It might require a very kind of long, or at least reasonably long period of no kind of catastrophes happening, no race dynamics of people fighting over control of the future, very kind of cooperative approach. And in particular, people who just really care about getting the right moral views. And once they're in positions of power, are then thinking, okay, how do we figure out what's correct? Understanding that probably I'm very badly wrong, rather than getting into a position of power and saying, okay, great. Now I can implement my moral views, the stuff that I care about, which is,
it's not the historical norm.
Exactly. When, how many, people have gotten to a position of power and then immediately hired lots of advisors, including moral philosophers and other people to try and change their ideology. My guess is it's zero. Yeah. I certainly don't know of an example, whereas I know of lots of examples of people getting power and then immediately wanting to just lock in their ideology.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, in building this case that the future or what people decide to do in future is probably quite contingent on actions, or could be contingent on actions that we take now. I guess that the main argument that you bring is that it seems like the values that we hold today, the things that we think today, are highly contingent on actions that people took in the past. And that's maybe the best kind of evidence that can be brought to bear on this question. What are some examples of that sort of contingency that we can see in views that we hold and practices that we engage in today?
So there are some that I think are pretty clear that they're kind of contingent. So attitudes to diet, attitudes to animals. are things that vary a lot from country to country. So most of the world's vegetarians live in India. That goes back thousands of years to kind of Vedic teachings. It's an interesting question. Like, imagine if the Industrial Revolution had happened in India rather than in Britain. Would we be on this podcast talking about, like, whoa, imagine a possible world in which, like, animals were just, incarcerated and raised in the billions to provide food for people. And, you were saying, wow, no, that's just way too crazy. Like, that's just not possible. I don't know. It seems like a pretty contingent event that's the way our kind of moral beliefs developed.
Yeah, I mean, so that's an interesting case where I guess we don't know the identities of the people, potentially like many different people who contributed to the subcontinent, India and other nearby areas, kind of taking this philosophical path where they were much more concerned about the well-being of animals than was the case in Europe or indeed like most other places. But we know that there must have been some people who made a difference because evidently it didn't happen everywhere. It's not something that everyone converges on.
Yeah.
So it seems like almost necessarily there has to have been decisions that were made by some people there, not elsewhere, that caused this path to be taken.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when we look at other things too, so I think the rise of monotheistic religions, certainly the rise of the Abrahamic religions seems pretty contingent. There's not really a strong argument I think one can give about why monotheism should have become so popular rather than polytheism.
Yeah. I suppose people do sometimes make arguments about how monotheism is either better for cooperation or more persuasive and appealing to people somehow. But the effect can't be that strong because it hasn't taken over everywhere. There's still, I guess, like you think of Japan, China, the Indian subcontinent, the Americas. I don't think any of them adopted monotheism, at least not until like very recently when Europeans basically forced them to.
For sure, yeah. And one of the interesting things that I think I hadn't fully appreciated before I started to get grips with the historical literature more, is that things you might think of as convergence are much more like a single culture getting very powerful and then that culture getting exported across the world. So another one is monogamy versus polygamy, where monogamous societies are the exception rather than the norm across history. But the kind of, European Western cultures promoted monogamy. And it seems like there's just a lot of either kind of direct exporting of that via colonialism, and also in some cases kind of just imitation as well, where countries see very kind of economically successful and militarily successful cultures and kind of just start trying to mimic that, including in all sorts of ways that maybe aren't very important. I mean, there are some arguments about why monogamous cultures are more economically successful, but that's certainly non-obvious. Certainly to the people adopting them. The example that I focus on most in the book is the abolition of slavery. And I go deepest into this because it's the example I know of. I mean, firstly, it's just the most important moral change that I know of. I mean, perhaps there's more, certainly among the most important moral changes in all history. And secondly, I think the case for it being in some important way contingent, that is, it could have gone either way, such that we could have current levels of technology and very widespread slavery, is much stronger than one might think. So we certainly, I think, shouldn't be very confident that current levels of technological development would lead to a society that had banned slavery. Maybe one thinks it's 50-50. Maybe actually you think it's more likely or not that we didn't. And, we talked about this more in the last podcast. I go deep into it in the book. One thing I should say is just, I'm not like some philosopher imperialistically going into history and then making all sorts of pontifications.
This is kind of the default view among people who've studied it?
Yeah, I don't have a great, I couldn't say definitively kind of what's the median view among academic historians, but certainly the idea that the abolition of slavery was economically determined, that is very, very out of fashion among historians now. And so the general view is that it was a cultural change primarily. And then there's a question of, okay, well, why did that cultural change happen? Was it actually just like really quite a contingent particular thing? There's, some real evidence for this. So the fact, you really don't see abolitionist campaigns occurring outside of, in fact, a campaign you don't see occurring outside of Britain. Abolitionist sentiment you don't really see outside of Britain and France, including United States as well. Whereas you look at like the Netherlands, which in some sense was the first modern economy, they had these petition campaigns that got like almost no signatures. There was like almost no abolitionist sentiment, almost no movement there. Industrial revolution could easily have happened in the Netherlands. Could have resulted in a very different kind of model landscape. So that's kind of one view, which is no, it's really quite particular. There's another view that there's some broader trend towards liberalism, democracy, a kind of ideology in favor of markets, and abolition was kind of part of that. And
you're even if it's not necessarily entailed, it's very adjacent conceptually, and
exactly.
So it was likely that it would take off at some point.
Exactly. And so then there's two questions. One is just where on the spectrum should that be? And then secondly is a question of, did we need this movement towards kind of liberalism, egalitarianism, in order to get to current levels of technology? And my honest guess there is also no. My guess is that it's helpful, but there are many things that are helpful. And so, if the kind of Western, Protestant culture that then led to kind of liberal culture had just never happened, I think China and other countries would have gotten to current levels of technological development. Maybe it would have taken a bit longer, probably not radically longer. And their culture might just be very different in some important ways.
Okay, so we've got all of these examples where it seems like what we believe today, what kind of culture is dominant globally, seems super contingent on events in the past that easily could have gone some other way. The fact that that is the case and that there doesn't seem to be overwhelming pressure to converge on doing the right thing, it's quite disturbing on some level, I feel, because it implies, firstly, that we should be super suspicious of the stuff that we think now, because,
sure.
If someone had fallen off a horse at the right time in a different century, then maybe we'll just have completely different views. It makes everything seem very arbitrary. Because it also makes it seem alarming, the possibility that we could kind of lock in ideas now, because the ideas we have now are, in that case, kind of arbitrary, different than what thought in the past. If people in the past had been able to lock us into their ideas, we would think that was awful.
Yeah.
It makes the path to the future feel a little bit more like a shit show if you buy this idea.
Yeah, I mean, an analogy I often think of is just imagine we're doing all the same things as we're trying to do now, facing the same risks, but we're in 2nd century Rome. 10% of the population own slaves. The elites, they attend the Colosseum to watch people get disemboweled or to, fight each other to the death. And they just love it intensively. Extremely patriarchal culture. Women just, the idea of female rights, just ludicrous.
Basically completely out of the picture politically.
Exactly, yeah. And now imagine some incredibly powerful technologies being developed. I would be really worried that Nero or Caligula would develop AGI.
Yeah.
I would really worry that even if AI is navigated safely in the sense that the AI does not destroy us all, and it's in human control, I would still be worried about what happens to that future, where the case of slavery is a case in point. Again, at some point in the future, digital beings will have, probably, it's hard to know, but probably will have sentience and will be kind of beings of moral status. At the moment, computer models, AI models, they are just property. So in some sense, the default trajectory is towards them continuing to be property indefinitely into the future. If you then also have an ideology where slavery is fine, you could imagine a future where the vast, vast majority of beings are slaves and not necessarily happy ones. Romans didn't have cosmopolitanism as an idea, impartiality, moral impartiality as an ideal. That would be pretty scary. And one can debate how scary is that compared to how scary is takeover by AI agents. But I think both are pretty scary.
Yeah.
And then, okay, how much better are we than the Romans? I think if you're looking at historical, I don't know, if you have the appropriate level of humility, I think we're better, for sure. But still very, very far away from the kind of best moral views. And that means a world in which potentially even well-meaning people that we would regard as good people now, were they to lock in their unreflective values, would be very bad indeed. And so what we really...
very, very far short of the best world that would be possible,
Yeah, I still think it would be, I think it would be good in the sense of it would still be a good future, but still an enormous loss of potential.
Yeah. Is there anything you can say to cheer us up? This sounds so great, or it sounds like we're in a very bad situation. I don't know.
Cool. I'll give the strongest arguments against my view.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's one argument I don't often hear, which is just, perhaps the moral truth is just a strong attractor. Just in the same way, I expect in 10,000 years,
they'll have great
beings
chemistry.
to have really great chemistry and really great physics. There's an argument you could make that, well, they'll have really great ethics too. And one could argue that, like, if there's no such thing as the moral truth, well, things don't matter anyway. There is obviously an intermediate view where you've got kind of a subjectivist view of metaethics where there's no ultimate fact of the matter, but the thing that...
You still want things to go one way
You still
rather than
think,
the other.
well, yeah, exactly. A second thought, though, is just like a future world where we are just much more advanced technologically, in particular via AI, has just a lot of advantages compared to the world today. So one thing is just like we know everything in like all the empirical facts. So, discrimination against other beings on the basis of believing them to be intellectually inferior or something is like,
I see.
If there's a kind of like that will not happen because unless people are like deliberately deceiving themselves in some way.
Yeah.
Because we've got like the kind of ideal information there.
I see. So some things that look like they're barbaric and were justified by barbaric philosophy might actually have been because of bad empirical beliefs, or at least, or at least they would have become untenable in the long run if people had had a full understanding of the world.
That's right, yeah. And some people say that that's like most moral disagreement. I strongly disagree with that view. I think in general, it's like the moral ideals are the horse, and the empirical beliefs are like the cart that's being dragged along, where people come up with some empirical reasons to justify their moral views rather than the other way around. But in the future, okay, we've got people, they've figured out empirically just everything. And then if we can get something that's like broadly like a kind of egalitarian liberal world, lots of people have substantial amounts of power, well, at least some proportion of them will be morally motivated and try and figure out what's best. And in a world with like a future tech and AI, there'll be lots of gains from trade. And so, perhaps there are the people who, they're kind of selfish and like they don't, or maybe they have some bad ideas, but like others are, the altruists, and they're like, no, I really care about what happens. Perhaps they can just like make compromises such that, one group wants great monuments built in their honor and will, produce all of these workers to do so. And then like another group says, okay, but can you make the workers kind of happy? And then we've got such technological abundance that it's very cheap for them to do that.
I see.
So perhaps a lot of these trades are like very easy. Like you can get enormous gains from trade potentially.
Yeah.
Because you can figure out all possible trades that could happen and then choose whatever ones are like getting 99% of like what both parties want.
Yeah.
That's the kind of optimistic.
Yeah, I guess another way to phrase what you're saying there is kind of that there's a lot of maybe... There could be in the future a lot of indifference to the well-being and flourishing of others, but there probably will also be a decent bunch of sincere altruism and concern for other people, and there won't be an offsetting amount of sadism where people are they're desperate to harm other people as much as possible. And so if you combine kind of indifference plus like nice altruism, then on average that actually works out to an okay situation.
Exactly. And in general, when we're thinking about the value of the long-term future, that's just the crucial asymmetry, where I think there's an enormous number of ways the future could go, such that we lose almost all of our potential. And those things are close to zero. They might be like a little bit good or a little bit bad. There are some ways in which the world could go, which are very, very good. We've got the people who are just really morally concerned and they're trying to just do the best thing possible. And it's very hard to see ways in which there's worlds where like things could go as badly as possible. Where, like how many people in history are like, the effective anti-altruists.
Yeah.
It's not even
effective sadism.
Exactly. Effective sadists.
How would they get along with one another, I suppose? I guess they need to limit their sadism to people outside the effective sadism movement. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to coordinate.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, they just love suffering as an ideal and want to produce as much suffering as possible. It's like things have gone really badly wrong if those are the people that control the future.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the way we should think about it. And this is true for futures in general, and then also within a future, something like this kind of more liberal egalitarian future where it's like, as you say, there's many people who are like, hey, I want castles for myself, or then there's other people who are like, look, we just want, whatever it is that's like morally best, morally just world, and then like, trade and compromise such that like, if something like well-being is the thing that matters, then like trade away suffering and like trade promotion of happiness.
Yeah. So to date, it seems like there's been a much bigger focus on extinction risk than there has been on kind of improving moral values. And I think one reason for that is that the idea of trying to convince other people to have better values, which in practice almost always cashes out to like the values that the speaker holds, or to trying to like basically persuade people of your perspective on things, it feels more hostile than trying to prevent a disaster that in principle everyone would be against. Yeah, should we worry that this kind of moral improvement like sounds good from one point of view, but it like isn't as cooperative as other activities in a way?
Yeah, I think there's two things I want to say. One is that I count AI safety and AI alignment as in the kind of values bucket or the trajectory change bucket, where even in the scenario where a missile-aligned AI takes over and kills everyone, civilization continues.
Right.
Precisely the threat is because the AI has its own goals and builds this civilization that's maximizing for paperclips or something very alien compared to us. And that's still of moral value and it like could be positive, could be negative. And it really matters whether that AI builds happy paperclips or unhappy paperclips or whatever else.
Yeah.
So I think like thinking of AI as an extinction risk in the sense of like, oh, and then that happens and then there's nothing afterwards is just from a moral perspective, I think, the wrong kind of framing. But then, yeah, secondly, onto your actual question of, yeah, promoting values or moral advocacy, is that hostile? And I think it really depends on the methods one uses. So if it's that I go around and I just brainwash people or trick people into having my moral views, which has happened a lot throughout time, there's just, again, the dictators take power and then brainwash their population as best they can, send propaganda. That seems very hostile. If, in contrast, it's like what the abolitionists did, which is you make arguments, you write books, perhaps you demonstrate, you like make more salient the suffering that is happening, then you try and like change both public and political elite opinion that way. I don't really see how that is hostile in the same way as trying to get people to have better empirical beliefs is also not hostile.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, the thing that might be missed in the hostile framing is that, so people have specific ideas about what's good, but they also have this like broader goal, at least most people, of like forming more accurate ideas or like wanting to engage in a continuous reflective process where their views will change and should change if they encounter new arguments that they find persuasive or new information that shifts their idea. So they're not just like machines that want to keep exactly the same values and exactly the same goals that they happen to hold at this instant, no matter what else comes up.
Exactly. And then if they're not, if it is, I don't know, Stalin and he has this ideology and he's like, I will never change my mind. It's not really the sort of agent that I think I should be cooperating with.
I see.
It's more like...
Because there's no reciprocity there.
Yeah, I think that was more just a bold intuition of mine. But the lack of reciprocity, I think, seems correct. There's not a relevant sense of like, oh, well, if we were in each other's shoes, like, you know, would Stalin be like looking out for me? And like, I don't think so.
Yeah, it makes sense. I guess, so there's... Within the framework of wanting to improve the trajectory that we're on, wanting to improve values, there's maybe like two different stories that people sometimes tell. One is this story of like us being on a very long-term journey where we want to engage in a very long-term reflection. And I guess on this picture, you know, humans are around for a very long time and we want to have like really good philosophy departments doing very good moral philosophy, I guess, as well as collecting relevant empirical information. The other is this kind of emergency situation where we might be about to create artificial intelligence quite soon. That creates the potential for like lock-in of whatever dumb stuff we happen to believe today. On which, because it's not about just like persuading people that we need to engage in some like extended reflection at some future time. Although, I mean, possibly you could take that approach. You might also just be like, we just have to like fix the like most barbaric dumb ideas that people hold now, so we don't like accidentally lock them in like the 2040s. Is that how you picture it? Yeah,
I mean, both of those things just seem correct to me. I mean, in the case of AI, I mean, there's obviously risks from misaligned AI takeover, risks from lock-in. And so the thing we want to do is like, okay, we want to have some process that's this like careful and carefully navigated trajectory from where we are today to then, you know, having like very well-informed and reflective moral beliefs. It's possible that happens in calendar time very quickly. Again, you know, we mentioned earlier that AI could very rapidly speed up kind of technological progress. Potentially, it could very rapidly speed up kind of ethical reflection as well. So if the arguments that AI leads to this kind of tech or intelligence boom happen, maybe in calendar time, this all happens over a decade or something.
I see, yeah.
But at least in the sense of just like how much intellectual progress is being made, it could be like huge difference between this kind of immediate lock-in and this like broader kind of reflective process.
Yeah, it seems in the like lock-in risk soon scenario, we do not have time to persuade everyone in the world of the importance of moral philosophy and to we don't even have time for you and I to spend years to come trying to improve our moral views and root out all of the errors that we might be making right now, let alone the entire world. And most people are focused on feeding themselves and getting things done. They don't have time for constant philosophy. So it seems like really the only path is to if you do have AIs that are substantially smarter than humans, able to do research faster than us, we need to find some way to explain what we think of as the project of philosophy and find some way to hand it over to them so they can do a better job of it than we've ever been able to. And then basically have them take over philosophy and fix it for us before they then go and change everything.
I think, so there's this idea of differential technological progress. Again, I think comes from Nick Bostrom. Just there's certain technologies you want before other technologies. And having AI systems that can morally reason very well, but aren't agents in the relevant sense. You just put in a question, they give out an answer, but they're not trying to make big changes, trying to make changes in the world. Ensuring that comes, which is more kind of if you see GPT-3
or Google Maps. Yeah.
Or Google Maps, exactly. That's kind of you put in text, you get out text, compared to, say, AIs that play StarCraft or something, which is more you give it an environment and then it's taking goals to improve its reward function. You really want those AIs that are just non-agentic, but yet
just oracles that answer questions within the constraints.
Exactly, able to give you answers. You really want them to come first. One thing I think I should say about the kind of values framing is that the natural thing to think okay, cool, I care about the values of the future. I'm going to go and take to the streets and convince people and that's definitely one thing that one can do. It's not the only implication by any means of thinking about the importance of values. Take the example of nuclear war. So normally the standard, the kind of long-termist analysis of a nuclear war is, well, what's the probability of a nuclear winter? Given a nuclear winter, how many deaths? What's the chance of this leading to extinction? But here's another thing, which is just nuclear war, even putting nuclear winter to the side, could result in just most of the liberal democracies in the world being wiped off the map.
Yeah.
And then what's the chance that we get back to this current level of technology? What's the chance that liberal democracy is the kind of predominant way of organizing society? I'm not sure. Again, it's one of these tough questions. It's on the order of kind of 50-50 is my guess. And then, well, would you prefer artificial general intelligence to be developed in a liberal democracy, or would you prefer it to be developed in some, dictatorship or authoritarian state? And again, I think much more likely to go well if it's the former rather than the latter. And it's quite plausible actually that that's the main, when we look to the very long-term future, that's the biggest deal when it comes to a nuclear war, is actually the impact of nuclear war and the distribution of values for the civilization that returns from that, rather than on the chance of extinction. And so I'm just using that as an example of how this kind of the potential sensitivity of the long-term future to the values that are predominant today, it starts to impact lots of things that we might care about.
Okay, yeah, zooming out for a second, I guess a potentially kind of crucial question that might shift someone between wanting to work on extinction versus wanting to work on this improving values cluster is whether they think the future is likely to be good, right now, conditional on us surviving. So if you think that, in fact, if we just on our current track don't go extinct, then we're likely to do more harm than good. We're likely to produce more suffering or more just bad things than offsetting positives. Then in fact you might be kind of indifferent to extinction from a long-termist perspective anyway. And so you're definitely going to want to focus on the values improvement. Yeah, what are kind of the key arguments either way on whether we should expect there to be more good stuff or bad stuff in the future, given where we stand today?
I think there are two categories of argument that one can make on this. And I should say both are pretty weak as far as evidence goes.
Yeah.
So one is you can just take an empirical argument. You can say, okay, throughout history, has the world been good or bad? And then secondly, what's the trend line looking like? How does that change over time? And then the second are more kind of theoretical arguments you can make. So I can take these in turn.
Yeah. One thing I really like in the book that I hadn't seen elsewhere is you try to do this sort of accounting of all of the goods and bads that have existed in the universe up to this point. Maybe you can walk us through that.
Sure, yeah. So I do this deep dive, and it's pretty wild to answer this question of just, has life so far been good or bad? And not only, the thing that normally happens is that this is evaluated from a pure utilitarian standpoint, whereas I think we should look at this from a variety of moral perspectives. I think on the question of, have things to date been good or bad, I think the answer is just it's unclear. So one thing that's weird is
if... cop-out, Will. Come on, pick a side.
No. I think I would, absolutely all things considered, I think I would probably say it's good, actually.
Okay.
That's like slightly controversial in these parts.
Yeah.
That comes a fair bit from moral uncertainty. I think it's... But here's the thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Looking backwards, let's say it's unclear where you draw the line at what beings are conscious or not. But let's say you allow invertebrates in there. Almost all beings are roundworms, nematodes.
Yeah.
And so you've got to answer the question. In fact, most of the question is just, what's a nematode life like? And if I say that's unclear, I think it doesn't sound so much like a cop-out anymore, but more just like, okay, this is really hard to know.
Yeah.
Even if you exclude invertebrates and you just look at vertebrates, 80% of all life years that have ever been lived, and again, this is extremely approximate, are fish.
Okay.
20% are amphibians and reptiles. And, that adds up to 100%, rounding up.
Yeah.
I think humans are like less than 1,000th of a percentage point.
I see.
And so, okay, now the main question is, what is life like as a fish? So, if you could be a randomly selected fish from all history...
Do you rate your chances?
Yeah. Is that good? Is that net good, or would you prefer to have never been born? Fish have terrible suffering. Obviously, their deaths are like very bad. Most of the deaths are short, though, in general. Most of the time is like swimming around as a fish. Seems like about neutral. So the main lesson, I think, is I think it's pretty close to the zero level compared to how good experience could be or how bad it could be, kind of on net. Then when I think we broaden out from utilitarianism and consider, at least total utilitarianism, consider other moral perspectives, we get considerations that push in both directions. So a total utilitarian says that adding a being to the world, if that being has more happiness than suffering, that's good. If it has more suffering than happiness, that's bad. But many views of population ethics say that actually, in order to add a being to the world to be good, it doesn't just have to be more positive than negative in terms of its experiences. It has to be sufficiently more positive than negative, actually, quite a bit better than zero. And views have that implication in order to escape what Derek Parfit called a repugnant conclusion, where you conclude that very, very large number of beings with lives that are just a little bit positive add up collectively to more than 10 trillion beings of lives of utter bliss, because just lots of little drops of water add up to more than a tank of water. But if you have this view that, okay, a life has to be sufficiently good for it to be positive, and below that it's negative, then you get the conclusion that life to date has strongly been negative.
Just because he thinks relatively few people or relatively few beings are going to be above whatever this kind of critical threshold is above which it's good for someone to exist.
Exactly, yeah. So if you think that what Parfit calls the repugnant conclusion world is a bad world, this indefinite life of beings that just barely lives worth living, at best, that's what history looks like.
I see.
Like the 600 million years in which we've had creatures with brains. And so you would conclude pretty strongly that history has been, the history of life has been bad. On the other hand, you might want to put in goods that are not just about well-being. And, if insofar as I'm sympathetic to views that don't just count well-being, actually these move me a fair bit, at least intuitively. So just the fact of complexity and social organization and having conscious experience at all. I think if
these things are valuable in themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And so, at least intuitively, I find that a pretty plausible moral view.
I feel like if you're someone who values justice and disvalues injustice, then things look almost even worse than they do to the utilitarian.
Okay.
Has there been justice in the world? Okay, you disagree. Interesting.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of, when we talk, so philosophers call these objective goods. They're things kind of other than well-being. I do think there's an asymmetry there where it's much plausible that there are, for many things, objective goods than objective bads. So it seems to me so people talk about knowledge being good.
Okay.
Where I think having a justified through belief is a good thing. I mean, I find it hard to get an intuition about that, but some people do. Whereas having a false belief being a bad thing, I'm I don't know if I find it hard to find that intuitive.
Okay.
Or the creation of complexity or consciousness being good in and of itself.
Yeah.
What's the what's the inverse of that? I'm like, oh, I don't think there really is one.
I see.
There might be some cases. So something that didn't make it into the book is this incredibly stirring passage from Robert Nozick, who talks about, injustices like the Holocaust, but also, the slave trades and so on. And his view is like, they were just so bad that they like outweigh. I mean, he actually puts it in even more poetic language. He says that it's humanity has lost its claim to continuation. Wow. Anything that you thought was distinctively valuable about humanity has been struck from the record because of these great injustices. All this is to say is that like once you get into these kind of objective goods and bads, how on earth do you do this accounting? Like you're just throwing intuitions around. And that's part of maybe the reason why I'm skeptical that such goods and bads actually exist.
Right.
But I want to be like ecumenical in the analysis here.
Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of the state of the world up until now. I guess if people want to hear more about that, they can read the book. The other important consideration you mentioned is the trajectory. So are things getting better than worse? I suppose we'll probably have to do this one a little bit more quickly. But do you want to summarize what you think the trajectory is?
So then I think two things. There's the trajectory of the world. My guess is that is getting better, even after you factor in the enormous amount of suffering that humanity has brought via factory farms. But I think if you look at the underlying mechanisms, it's more positive, where in the long-term future, how many beings do you expect to be agents, as in they're making decisions and they're reasoning and making plans, versus patients, which are beings that are conscious but are not able to like
control the
circumstances, where the trajectory to date is pretty good for agents. So certainly since the Industrial Revolution, I think human well-being has just been getting better and better. Then for animals, it's quite unclear. So there are far fewer wild animals than there were before. Whether that's good or bad depends on your view on whether wild animals have lives that are good or bad. There are many more animals in factory farms, and their lives are decisively worse. However, I think it's unlikely that when you extrapolate these trends into the distant future, that you expect there to be very large numbers of moral patients, rather than like it mainly consisting of, moral agents who can control their circumstances.
It's interesting. On this model, basically, until there were humans, basically everyone was a moral patient in the sense that maybe wild animals, I guess with like some conceivable partial exceptions, they neither had really the intellectual capacity nor the like practical know-how to control the situation in which they're in order to make their lives much better.
Yeah.
And so the fraction of all like conscious experience that's being had by agents is kind of going from zero, like gradually up. And we might, at least so long as we don't allow there to be patients by effectively like prohibiting future forms of slavery, then we might expect it to reach 100 and then for most of their lives to be reasonably good.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it makes sense that their lives are reasonably good because, well, they want their lives to be good and they're able to change it.
Yeah.
And so then that relates to the kind of final argument, which is the more kind of like sitting in an armchair thinking about things argument, but which I think is very powerful, which is just that, as we said earlier, some agents systematically pursue things that are good because they are good. Very, very few agents systematically pursue things that are bad because they are bad.
Yeah.
Lots of people do things because they're self-interested, and that has negative side effects. Sometimes people can be confused and think what they're doing is good, but actually it's bad. But I think there's this strong asymmetry between, if you imagine a very best possible future, like how likely is that? What's happened? And I can tell a story which is like, hey, we managed to sort out these risks. We had this long deliberative process. People were able to figure things out, and people just went and tried to produce the best world. That's not so crazy. But then if I tell you the opposite of that, it's like, oh, we have a worst possible world. Like everyone got together and decided to make the worst possible world. It's like, seems very hard indeed.
Yeah.
So I think it's like very plausible to me that we squander almost all of the value we could achieve. It's like totally on the table that we could really bring about like a flourishing near best society. And then seems much, much less plausible that we bring about truly worst society. Yeah. And that's why the kind of trajectory of the future, I think the value of it skews positive.
Yeah. Just before we move on, this question of like, or either will the future be good or bad, or like, has the universe been good up until now or bad up until now? These seem like such important, like fundamental questions for understanding existence, understanding our situation. that you'd think that there'd be like lots of professors, lots of academics who specialized in this question of, I'm in the subdiscipline of like understanding what it's like to be a fish in order to like help to answer this broader question of whether the universe has been good or bad. Yeah. And yet it's funny because you know that there are going to be no academics who have specialized in this question more or less. I don't think that there actually are any, or that this is like a discipline exactly. It just seems crazy. It's just such a funny,
It's completely crazy to me. I mean, especially if philosophers are going to talk about anything, you think it would be this. But you get, David Benatar has made some arguments. Parfit makes these like casual comments. But yeah, very, very few people have like really given a sustained treatment of this topic.
Yeah.
The problem is wider than that. So within psychology, here's a question. How many people in the world today, or kind of in psychology and economics, how many people in the world today have lives that are above zero, such that they are actually happy to have lived? This is enormously important. Forget all the long-termist stuff. Suppose you're just doing public health. It really matters. Like if you're weighing life-saving interventions compared to interventions that improve quality of life, it really matters the answer to that question.
Because it's basically the same logic as with the species at the species level. Because you say, well, if people's lives are actually just like bad,
exactly,
then we don't want to like let's set aside extending life for now and just improve their lives so that it's good when their lives are longer.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And it means you might be sympathetic to people who smoke or people who take drugs that shorten their life expectancy but are improving the quality of life while they are alive.
Right.
Obviously, smoking is also addiction and so on, or just like lots of things like. If your life is close to zero in well-being, then shortening your life expectancy in order to make your well-being greater just makes sense. Yeah. And so before this book was written, how many published studies were there addressing this question?
I'm going to guess zero.
Zero is the answer, exactly. So there's still zero published studies. There's one unpublished by Joshua Green, Matt Killingsworth, that somewhat does address this question, looking at just people in the US in particular. And then I commissioned one that's just by Abigail Hoskin, Lucius Caviola, and Joshua Lewis, that's just directly asking people, a variety of questions, but including, does your life contain more happiness than suffering? We asked that of people in the US and India. And so among the respondents, 16% of respondents in the US said that their life contained more suffering than happiness, and about 40% said it was more happiness than suffering.
Yeah.
In India, it was 9% that said that they had more suffering than happiness. So Indian respondents actually
rated their lives better.
Their lives better than
by
the
that
US.
measure.
Yes, and then these aren't representative of the country necessarily. But that's still that kind of the standard economic method of doing cost-effectiveness analysis, the quality-adjusted life year, assumes that death is the worst state you can be in. That's zero. You can't go below zero. Whereas the empirical evidence is that lots of people think their lives are worse than zero. And that would really mean that we should switch, have much more focus on improving quality of life rather than saving life.
Yeah, which is quite an intuitive implication in a way. Lots of people have said, well, we massively underrate the importance of treating mental health, for example, over physical ailments for reasons kind of along these lines.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, let's push on and talk about some of the various concerns or objections or clusters of worries that people have about long-termism, either philosophically or in practice. I guess one strain of criticism that I've heard a ton over the last 10 or 15 years is that because long-termists are trying to have positive effects that are very far down the road, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of years in the future, there isn't really a very good feedback loop to figure out whether what we're doing is helping or harming. And so this basically makes the entire enterprise far less tractable than, say, trying to improve the health of people around today, where you can clearly see whether you cured someone of cancer or whether they died of cancer. You get this very rapid feedback loop that allows you to improve what you're doing very quickly. Whereas if you're even just on the measure of trying to prevent nuclear war right now, you'll never really know whether you succeeded. Very hard to tell what things will work and what things won't. But then thinking about the longer term kind of chain of consequences that you're trying to bring about, if you're trying to prevent a nuclear war in order to then make the future go better in some of the ways that the indirect channels that you've been describing, you'll be long dead before you ever figure out whether that worked. And so you're just kind of floundering around in the dark. I'll let you maybe give your favorite formulation of this concern first, and then maybe you can respond to it.
I thought your formulation was very good, where you might just think, look, most activities have very little impact indeed. The way you manage to avoid having very little impact is precisely by like testing and learning and iterating. And if you're just trying to do good, because of these like somewhat armchair arguments, perhaps, again, this is how the criticism would go, you're just as likely to do harm as you are to do good. And so really you should think that you're having about zero impact.
Yeah. Yeah. Why isn't this a decisive objection?
Well, I think it's like very important. Like,
it's a great objection.
It's a great objection, exactly. And I think it's something like we should be really worried about. There's two thoughts. One is like kind of sad response. A second is like somewhat more optimistic. Yeah, the more pessimistic response is just, unfortunately, this bleeds into everything.
Yeah.
So once you've endorsed the evaluative claims that most value is in the future, because most people are in the future and they matter too, then we're not getting feedback loops on anything. So you might be working in development and you're, providing benefits. You're getting, feedback loops on whether bed nets work. But almost all the value is in the very long-term future. And how does saving someone's life, them insecticide-treated bed nets, impact the very long-term future? Well, there's lots of, there's just many, many, many like causal consequences. You're not getting any feedback loops on whether those causal consequences are good or bad.
Yeah.
And
you're just as in the dark empirically as the folks who are doing more peculiar long-termist stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
And both of you are stuck just making theoretical arguments, like based on your model of the world, about which things you expect to have better long-term consequences.
Exactly. And that's even if you say, oh, but I just think that all just washes out all of those, knock-on effects of, improving economic development or saving lives. They'll just cancel out. That is itself a claim.
Yeah.
And in fact, just as speculative a claim and actually quite a bold claim.
Yeah.
And so, the pessimistic response is just, we're all in that situation. And if you think like, okay, well, that means that we're just completely shooting in the dark, that just applies to everything. And so there's a little bit of a kind of dominance argument you can make against this, which is, well, perhaps we can't learn because we don't have feedback loops. Then just everything's on the table. Like everything's just equally as good or equally as bad, depending on your perspective.
Yeah.
But then, well, there's nothing we can do in that world. So we shouldn't really think about it. We should at least act on the assumption that well-meaning people who are really trying to reason about things are doing, at least better than neutral. They're doing like a little bit good, which is what I think.
Yeah. Okay, so the argument here is an asymmetry between... So we could live in a world where people who try to improve the long-term future, because of the unforeseeability of things, in fact, their actions on average are of neutral value. They neither help nor hurt. Some help and some hurt, that cancel out. We could live in a world where people who try to make the long-term future go better, in fact, on net, make things worse.
Yeah.
Because maybe they're drawn to counterproductive activities by some mechanism. Or we could live in a world where things are very obscure. It's hard to tell what impact your actions have, but nonetheless, people have some ability to discern actions that are more likely to do harm, more likely to make things better than to make them worse. Now, you want to say there's an asymmetry between the second and third one, that it's unlikely that we live in a world where people like you and me trying to make the long-term future go better, in fact, are drawn systematically to harmful activities.
Absolutely.
And so instead, you kind of are choosing between the first and the third, and then on average, that suggests that things are positive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Do you want to explain why the second one is unlikely?
Well, I just think, again, you've got, people who are like aiming to achieve something, carefully reasoning about achieving something. Like, in general, if I learn, like, this person is trying to achieve X, does that make X happening more or less likely? So it's like obviously more likely because there's this kind of agent trying to make X happen. And people in general do achieve their goals, or at least make their goals more likely rather than less likely. And then similarly in this case, well, what does the evidence say about how best to achieve our goals of, making the long-term future go better? Well, evidence in general points in good direction.
Yeah.
As in, makes your beliefs more likely to be true than false. Do I have reason to think that we're, more likely to believe true things than false things? I think yes, and I think that's amply demonstrated in cases where we do get feedback effects. Forecasting makes this kind of very clear. So that kind of clearly, I think, tilts things in a positive... Between those two, you get things tilted clearly in a positive direction.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so another kind of broad cluster of concerns that you hear quite a bit about long-termism is that it proves too much, or I guess in some ways it's too close to being a fanatical idea. And yeah, this comes in various different flavors. But basically, if you buy that we should care about future generations, at least somewhat per person, and you also buy that trillions and trillions or trillions of people could exist in future, then it seems like you might plausibly believe that you should do really extreme stuff just because it might have some tiny influence on humanity's trajectory or all of these things in the future. So in practice, that might mean, totally changing your job or giving away all your money or breaking the law just to have some negligible impact, basically, of producing some vast amount of value far in the future. And I think a lot of people think it's kind of even more weird and unappealing than that, because the impact that you might be having if you quit your job and did something completely different is so totally unknown. It's not only uncertain in the sense that it's unknown whether a coin that you'll flip is going to come up heads or tails, but it's much more deeply unknown than that. It feels like super speculative, betting your entire career on your estimate of what are the chances that there are aliens that look like horses somewhere in the Andromeda galaxy. It just feels like pulled out of your rear end. Yeah, do you want to give a formulation of this fanaticism objection that you like, or maybe I did an okay job of it there?
Well, I think there's a few different objections that maybe got run together there. So the first one is about tiny probabilities of enormous amounts of value. And that's, a problem for decision theory, where I think very intuitively, okay, I can give you, I can produce some guarantee of good, like saving a life, or a 1 in a trillion chance of producing a sufficiently large amount of value that the expected value, that is the amount of value multiplied by the probability of achieving it, is even greater than the expected value of saving one life. And it feels like, okay, so what do we do? And I'm like, it really doesn't seem like you should do the incredibly low probability thing.
Yeah.
That seems very intuitive. And then the answer is can you design a decision theory that avoids that implication without having some other incredibly counterintuitive implications?
Yeah.
It turns out the answer is no, actually.
Right.
Now, this isn't to say that you should do the thing that involves going after tiny probabilities of enormous amounts of value. It's just within the state where we can formally prove that there's a paradox here.
Yeah.
That... I'm sorry, just the philosophers have failed you. We have no good answer about what to do here.
In this respect, yeah.
I think in practice, thankfully, we don't actually need to really encounter this issue because the probabilities we're talking about are not astronomically small in this way. So what's my probability of extinction from engineered pandemics this century? I tend to say about 0.5%. You could easily say it's higher or lower. That's not a low probability. What's my chance of dying in a car crash in the course of my life?
It's about the same.
Might be about the same. Yeah. Do I wear a seatbelt? I absolutely wear the seatbelt.
Yeah.
And in fact, I wear the seatbelt even if I'm taking just a 1 mile drive. That's about a 1 in a 300 million chance of dying. Still seems like a good thing to do. And so society as a whole is taking really, and then I think the risks from AI are much higher again. So society as a whole is really taking some quite meaningful risks without any sort of precautions at all. And so we're really not at all in the world where it's this is a 1 in a trillion chance. In fact, it's a world where these are really quite meaningful probabilities. And as a community, I think we're actually going to make a reasonably large dent in these probabilities while also probably making the world better in the near term along the way. So even though I think there's just not really a good answer about what to do about these tiny probabilities of enormous amounts of value, that doesn't mean that if a probability is 1 in 1,000 or 1 in a million, that's not so small as to be getting into these terrible issues.
Yeah. I guess just to calibrate people, political scientists try to estimate what's the probability of an election being swung by a single vote. And in a smallish country, in a moderately close election, it's often 1 in a million.
Yeah.
In the biggest countries, it's more 1 in 10 million if you live in a swing seat or a swing state and so on. And I think many people will accept that it could be reasonable to go and vote in an election in the hope that you will swing it, because the impact will be really massive if you do, even though the probability of swinging the election is really low. Or at least the fact that the odds of swinging the election is low is not an in-principle argument why it must always be irrational to vote, because you're somehow getting messed around by impossibly low probabilities.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I suppose, yeah, we might think that the probability of some of the projects that we're engaged in preventing human extinction or putting us on a better track, at least on the order of like 1 in 10 million, given how few people are working on some of these problems that we think, have very serious, like you're saying 1 in 200 or maybe like higher chance of ending humanity.
Could be ending, yeah. And like and especially people, I think the right way often to think is like, as the member of the community that is taking action that you're a part of, like, in other contexts, if it's like, oh, I'm going on this protest, it's like, oh, well, what's the chance of affecting change? It's like, well, that's just not the way of thinking about it. It's like, because we're very bad at reasoning in that way. Instead, you think like, well, there's this whole movement doing climate protests or whatever. That movement maybe has a significant chance, 10% chance of making policy. And that would be really huge. And I'm like, maybe 1,000th of the movement or something. Yeah. Then you can be like, okay, yeah, this is actually looking like a good use of time.
Yeah. So some people brought this up in response to the last time that we talked about this general idea, is they were saying, well, sure, maybe the risk of humanity going extinct because of bioweapons or whatever is 1 in 200, but your individual chance by contributing, by working on that problem of preventing that from happening is much, much lower, more like in the chance of 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million, 1 in 100 million. And I think we think there's kind of some other conceptual, or like they're thinking about it the wrong way, as you're saying, because you could apply this to all kinds of actions that require more than one agent, or even require you to engage in sustained effort over a period of time where you're kind of coordinating with yourself on different days. And we think it's actually worth thinking at a more like group level, where you think, given the full cost of a project, given all of the people who might have to participate in it for it to reach a reasonable scale, and given the probability of that project as a whole with all of those inputs succeeding, is it worth it in aggregate? And then if it is, then it's probably worth it for each of the individual contributors to participate in it. And that's a much more like natural way of evaluating whether something is worthwhile than thinking about whether it's worth you going in for one individual day more to work on the project. It's like too granular.
Exactly. And we don't have good intuitions about it. And if you don't have that view, then you have this weird thing where it's like, oh yeah, the climate protest community as a whole, they should be doing this protest, but every individual is wrong to do so. It's like, what? Like, okay, there's something weird there. If you think, okay, a large group of people is above the probability threshold for acting, but if the individual is below, it's like, come on, something's gone wrong there in your reasoning.
Yeah, and also it has nothing to do with long-termism in particular.
Exactly. This is just a general issue for decision theory. And and then the other thing that I find wild is that sometimes people declare fanaticism with very large probabilities. I had someone say, well, well, who, but they have power. Like 5% is like, oh, yeah, that's a fanatical probability. I'm like, okay, no, do you not take out insurance? Like, you don't wear a seatbelt?
Hold on, what do you mean by a fanatical probability?
As in, if you're doing something and there was like a 5% chance of catastrophe resulting from it,
I see.
That's too low a probability. You should just ignore that.
Okay, just in principle, you should dismiss such possibilities.
Exactly, yeah. And like, surely they can't have been serious in the like deep sense of like how that would affect their actions.
Yeah.
But in general, people are just very poor at reasoning about probabilities. And so there's this other thing of just, even if I'm saying like, oh, it's a 1 in 100 chance, people are like, oh, I don't know how to reason about that. Whereas look at things like, taking out fire insurance, wearing a seatbelt, exercising, like loads and loads of things we do are making differences that are far, far smaller to, your chance of dying, for example, or losing your house.
Yeah. Okay, so that's one strain of the fanaticism concern. What's another one?
So then a couple of other things you linked to. One was just, should we sacrifice like all of the present well-being for the sake of posterity? It's like, okay, well, there's so much at value at stake. Future people outnumber us 1,000, 1,000,000, trillion to 1. So even if the present generation is entirely impoverished, surely that would be the right thing to do if it makes the future go even a little bit better.
Yeah. Sounds bad.
It sounds bad.
Yeah. What's the response?
Well, I think there's two again. The first one, which is really the most important thing, is, again, like, maybe we figure that out when we come to it, which will be never. Because at the moment we, spend, and pick this number out of the air of 0.1% of global resources on making the long term go better. It's probably even less than that in the relevant sense. Let's bump that up to 1% or something, and then we'll see. The world where we're really getting to like, oh, should it be 50% or should it be 90% or should it be even higher, I think is just like very far away. And again, like I think that probably by that point we're just generally building a flourishing society.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than like anything that's like very targeted.
And we're not just far away from that world by happenstance. It's because people care about themselves and are not like so altruistic that they tend to completely work themselves to the bone and make themselves miserable in order to help people who aren't even around.
Exactly.
It's kind of like saying, oh, if you argue that climate change is so important, then like we should completely impoverish ourselves, or like as a small nation, we should completely impoverish ourselves in order to prevent climate change. But it's like, that's never going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like we can't even get people to coordinate to do like basic stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there is this more general philosophical question of what are the demands of morality. And so it really maps the classic Peter Singer arguments that, okay, I've given 90% of my income away and now I'm on, like, let's say it's £5,000 per year. But that's still a lot more than the poorest people in the world. And by donating, half of that over the course of a couple of years, I can save a life. Well, it's only half your income. You still live on that. And that's not worth as... being a bit poorer is not comparable to saving a life. And so from the Peter Singer arguments, just looking at extreme poverty, it seems like you get this conclusion that you should just keep giving and giving until...
You're in absolute penury.
Exactly. And then it's like, okay, well, a lot of people, I think, okay, that's too extreme. But at the same time, we should be doing more than we are now. There's some kind of middle ground. And again, I think moral philosophers have just failed us on that one. Okay. I don't really know of like a good principled philosophical account of where one draws the line, such that like there's plenty of practical advice, which we've talked about a lot, reflect, set what's a good line for how much one plans to give.
Choose something sustainable.
Choose something
that other people can emulate.
Yeah, exactly. There's lots of things like that. But in terms of a deep philosophical principle, it's really hard for the answer not to be that you either should give nothing or everything you can.
Yeah, I suppose the alternative would be that you say it's a threefold like difference. You can value yourself exactly 3 times as much as people in severe poverty.
But actually, even that wouldn't work.
Okay, because then if people get poorer, then...
Well, no, because let's say you value yourself 3 times as much, you still give everything. So you now don't have to give to exactly the level at which you are as poor as someone living in extreme poverty. It's very close.
Yeah,
because at the moment, like, you can provide like 100 times as much benefit as you can to yourself.
Yeah.
So I guess if you're 3 times richer, well, the poorest people in the world live on about $2 per day. That's like $600-700. So, okay, you're living on about £1,000 per year.
Right.
That's the 3x equivalent.
I see. Yeah, so the problem is, like, no matter what number philosophers pull out of a hat for that ratio, then it just becomes an empirical question of, like, how severe is the poverty and how rich are you? And, like, in totally imaginable worlds, you're still going to be making enormous sacrifices.
Exactly. And, yeah, you get this parallel issue when you're thinking about the long-term future. So, okay, we should weigh the interests of the present generation more than future generations. I think that's true. I have special relationships with people in the present. They have given me benefits that I should give them back. Okay, so how much more weight do you give? Well, this has come up in the context of a discount rate. If you discount the well-being of future generations, basically by any number at all, but by the same number every year, then you give them essentially no weight at all. And that seems wrong. Seems clearly wrong.
Seems harsh.
Exactly. If you give them no weight at all, if you give no discount rate at all, then they're of overwhelming importance and we should sacrifice everything. There's basically no, like, really satisfactory theoretical middle ground.
Can you have a geometrically decreasing discount rate? Or, like, the discount rate itself, like, reduces each year into the future?
You can, yeah.
Because you have time and consistency problems.
Yes. I think that is how you should discount. It's called a declining discount rate schedule.
Okay.
But it's still going to be like you're completely hostage to how many future people there will be.
I see, yeah.
And so, again, you get either the conclusion that you do nothing because there aren't enough future people to outweigh this, or it's kind of like overwhelming importance.
Yeah, I suppose because it becomes empirical again, then you could live in a world where you think, let's say, there's only the Milky Way galaxy, and so and in that world you're entitled to have a good life, and then you discover that there's other galaxies, and now you're like, oh no, based on the discount rate that I'd chosen before, I just have to give away absolutely everything.
Exactly, which just doesn't seem that plausible.
It's not intuitive.
But on the other hand, if it's like, surely the amount we ought to do is sensitive to the stakes. So, like, let's say, Rob, you've donated so much that you're now on £1,000 per year. You can go down to £500 per year. The world will end if you don't.
Okay.
Seems like morally you ought to do that. And it seems that's because the stakes really are relevant.
Yeah.
So, I think we face the same issue when we're thinking about, again, from the philosophical perspective, like, how much ought the present to give for future generations? I think there's no like really firm line that isn't between like 0, which is implausible, and everything, which is also implausible.
It feels like what people want to do intuitively is say something like, in a normal world, you should, dedicate a third of your time or a third of your money at most to like helping other people.
Yeah.
And then unless things become like way worse than like what we're used to, then that is an acceptable amount, and you shouldn't be very sensitive on the margin to how the world is. It's like we want to do buckets somehow and then just like not have the buckets like spill over between like the personal and the altruistic bucket, except in like very extreme circumstances.
Yeah, but then it's hard to argue that we're not in those very extreme circumstances.
Yeah.
And so in both of these cases, so the fanaticism case, the probabilities, I'm like, man, we've just got no idea. In this case, I'm like at least more sympathetic to the idea that like, yes, in terms of pure moral philosophy, like in principle, we should just do as much as we can to do the best thing. But again, like in practice, I just don't think it makes a difference, because like the idea of like all of society dedicating itself to making the long-term future go well, it's like so ridiculously far off. What's actually happening now is it's just, do we give it essentially no concern, or do we give it like some concern? And that's just robustly like a good thing to do. Yeah.
I thought you might give kind of a different response to this, which is that there's maybe like different classes of moral concern. So, this impartial morality, or this impartial concern for the well-being of others that is kind of driving long-termism, that's like one class of moral concern, and we should maybe bracket how demanding that can be. And then it has to be weighed up against other classes of moral concern we have, like concern for people we know, concern for the world, like the concern for people around today. That has a different driving motivation, and it should get some significant fraction of our resources as well, because it's a different magisterium, and it can't just be traded off one for one against the impartial one.
Yeah, so that's a way you could go. But again, it seems weird. It just seems weird for it to be completely stakes insensitive. So it's like, okay, let's say it's a third on making things go better, impartially speaking. And, I spent a third of my income, or the present generation has spent a third of its GDP. But now some new opportunity arises.
Much better than the previous ones.
Yeah, and really it's an emergency situation. Like the entire future is going to get turned into a like dystopian hellscape. If only we'd spend that extra percent. Obviously that matters. So having these kind of like hard cutoffs is like, again, from this like philosophy perspective, like not something that ends up theoretically satisfying at all.
Yeah, I suppose, so on the demandingness thing, you can either end up, you kind of have to bite one of the bullets of either like the potential for fanatic demandingness, or the potential for fanatic indifference to the harm that will be done if you don't act. And it is very hard to find any middle ground between these.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly.
What about, I thought you might suggest that the idea of moral uncertainty, which you've written a lot about, might in some way bail us out here and help us find a reconciliation.
So it's helpful on a different issue. So in general, like very broad brush stylistically, I think when you take... So there are these two major camps within moral philosophy, consequentialism and non-consequentialism. Consequentialism differs from non-consequentialism in two ways. One, it says that you don't really have personal prerogatives. So if there's something that's like, oh, it could be good for the world, but it would benefit me more if I, use this money to spend it on myself rather than helping others. Consequentialism says, no, you should just always do the thing that's best, even if that's best for other people. Non-consequentialism says, sometimes it's okay. Like, it can be permissible to benefit yourself rather than just the impartial good. The second way in which consequentialism and non-consequentialism differ is on side constraints. So consequentialism says, in principle at least, it's just always about what outcome you produce. So if you can save, more lives at the cost of sacrificing one life, then you ought to do that. And again, there's big debates on how much the thought experiments that philosophers talk about are ever applicable in real life. Whereas non-consequentialists say, like, no, ends don't always justify the means. Sure, if it's like 1 billion people at stake, maybe you need to sacrifice one. But if it's just 10 people, then people have a right to life. And similarly for rights against other things, like side constraints against stealing or telling lies and so on. And I kind of think once you properly take moral uncertainty between the two, it's kind of one each for consequentialism and non-consequentialism, where as per the consequentialist, morality becomes very demanding. Because it's like, okay, I could spend money on myself or I could give it to help others. Well, the non-consequentialist says it's permissible either way. The consequentialist says, oh no, it's wrong if you don't give it. So under moral uncertainty, the best compromise is to give the money. On the other hand, for side constraints, I think that non-consequentialism weighs quite heavily there, where let's say it's, sacrificing one to save two others. Consequentialist at least does say, you ought to do that. The non-consequentialist, though, in my view, is saying like, oh, it's really wrong to do that.
Yeah.
And so at least often you should take side, given that you're giving some weight to non-consequentialism, which I think you should, then you should take side constraints pretty seriously and often not act in a way that will do the most good, because it would involve violating rights or breaking some other moral side constraint.
Yeah. I guess exactly how you aggregate between those two, or how you figure out what the trade-off is in any specific case is a vexed issue.
Yeah, that's much more complicated, but at least it points in a particular direction.
Yeah.
And then, and that relates to the final aspect of fanaticism that you mentioned, of could concern for the long-term future, could that just justify anything? What about atrocities? People sometimes kind of associate concern for the long term with, what about kind of, dictators who had some ideology or vision? I think utopianism, people can think that's kind of dangerous. I think the key thing there is just strongly distinguishing between do you have a positive vision of a good future? Long-termists often don't even necessarily, you don't even have to have that, apart from a very vague sense of the
future could be really good.
It could be really good. We want people to be happier, want people to be reasoning about things. But even if you do have a utopian vision, that does not mean that any ends justify the means. And one thing we've learned through history is just people who are doing bad things for a greater good is that doesn't go well. And so I think both on pure consequentialist grounds, taking extremely cooperative kind of common sense approaches to doing good is just exactly right. And so we've seen this with the certain animal rights campaigning. So there were extreme wings of the animal rights movement that would send bombs in the mail to MPs and things. That was just so bad for the animal movement, as well as just morally wrong in and of itself. And so similarly, just look, we have this good arguments in favor of taking the long term seriously. We should promote that. We should take these cooperative actions that make the short term better, as well as making the long term better. That seems really good, as well as having moral reasons not to violate side constraints in pursuit of kind of a greater good. So I think that's really overdetermined.
Yeah. Yeah, every so often I complain that there's kind of no strain of utopianism in society anymore, or people just focus constantly on dystopias and don't really think about how the future could be far better.
Yeah.
And I think one reason for that is that utopianism has developed a very bad reputation because in the past it's been used to justify all kinds of horrific things, or it's motivated people to engage in horrific actions as part of political revolutions that basically 100% of the time backfire and are really catastrophic. So, I think the lack of positive visions for the future, even sometimes among long-termists, or not that much interest in spelling out how the future could be far better, I think there's downsides to that. But a really positive thing is that this horrific history of utopianism in the past has really inoculated us against this idea that you can justify atrocities, or that you could justify really otherwise morally bad actions because the consequences will be good. It's so hard to point to people who advocate for that in practice. Even if in some sense their philosophy might imply it, it's just no one's willing to go there.
Yeah, and I do think, I agree, it would be good to have more of a strain of positive utopian thinking. So a little side project I've done with the book is a project called Future Voices, which is working with authors to write short stories that are voices of future people. And they can write on anything, but I think there will be a bit of a positive bent precisely to fill this gap where there's a lot of dystopian fiction. And so Ian McEwan, who wrote Atonement, is one of the authors. Jeanette Winterson is another, and Naomi Alderman. And I'm quite excited to see how it turns out.
Yeah.
As you know, I did a little bit of dabbling in utopian fiction as well, which is there's an Easter egg in the book that you can maybe find. But but then that's just a very different thing from this ends justify the means mentality, which is systematically very bad, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So we've dug into two strands of objection there, the fanaticism as well as the intractability. I guess, to keep this interview at a sane length, we've had to somewhat constrain what objections we're going to bite into today. Are there any other ones that you are kind of keen to highlight, or at least flag for the audience?
I mean, going back to previous discussion, this idea of just, maybe we're really missing things, and missing crucial moral or empirical insights. And so therefore just, generations to come, maybe that's ourselves later in our life, or maybe it's the people who take up the torch for trying to do good, they can do even more good than us. I think like that's a really important consideration and can affect kind of, how much of our resources do we want to go all in on the priorities that seem most pressing now? And I think it's a lot, but I still also think we should be trying to create a kind of community and movement such that people can, in 50 years' time, once they've learned a lot more, take action to make the world better, even if that's in a way that's kind of not what we would call long-termist now, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, let's push on to a specific chapter of the book that I thought was particularly interesting. And I guess in particular, it covered a bunch of stuff that we'd never talked about on the show before. So I was keen to dive into it. We had quite a smorgasbord of chapters and topics that we could go into, and just had to basically pick one. And this is the one I went with. So yeah, one trajectory that you contemplate in What We Owe the Future is the scenario where, say, there's no big global disaster or anything like that. The future is, in a sense, like a little bit boring compared to the stuff that we've been talking about. But rather, instead, we just see technological and economic and possibly cultural improvement like peter out and stagnate for an extended period of time, over the next 100 or 200 years. So it's kind of, a stagnation scenario. I think the chapter is called Stagnation.
Yep.
Yeah. Why should we think that might happen?
So the core argument is this. From the data, it looks like, what causes economic progress to occur, technological advancement? Well, it's just having more ideas about how you combine raw materials into new things. And a significant amount is just how much of development of new ideas is like how much time are people trying to develop new ideas, which we could think of as just fraction or total number of person hours going towards R&D. And just we kind of keep that as an abstraction. What's the story then of why we have had pretty, at least in frontier economies, fairly steady kind of technological progress, over the last couple of centuries, so fairly steady economic growth? It turns out there's two things that have been going on, and they approximately balance each other out. On the one hand, ideas have been getting harder and harder to find. So this kind of qualitatively makes sense, Einstein was able to develop, theory of general relativity, just sitting in his attic in his spare time as a patent clerk, or at least for special relativity. But it was really just armchair reasoning. Now the kind of latest advance in physics is it requires a multi-billion-dollar hadron collider. The advance of discovering the Higgs boson is it's really pretty minor compared to theories of special and general relativity.
Yeah. So the returns per dollar or per hour have gone way down in physics. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. But then there's arguments, so there's this paper, Are Ideas Getting Harder to Find, suggests this is true just really quite generally. So that's one thing. So ideas are kind of getting exponentially harder to discover. At the same time, we've been throwing exponentially more time at doing the equivalent of R&D. So there's two ways in which that's happened. One is just the population has grown a lot. So by approximately 7 billion over the last couple of 100 years. So we've just got a larger labor pool for people to be doing R&D. And then secondly, we've been putting a larger and larger proportion of the population onto R&D. So the proportion of the population who are, for example, trying to design new computer chips, it's just, can't remember that quantitatively, but it's tens, maybe hundreds of times greater than it was even just a few decades ago. And that's been required to keep Moore's law going.
Yeah, and I guess, so more broadly across society, so we've had population growth, but we've also had explosive growth in the fraction of the population that has finished high school and then has finished university and then has finished PhDs and people who are doing knowledge jobs.
Exactly.
That's gone from basically a negligible fraction to quite a significant number now.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's been the kind of trajectory so far. Looking ahead, do we expect these trends to continue? Well, population projections are that population will plateau about 11 billion. You can argue with precisely the number, but the world as a whole is only barely above replacement now. In fact, it's below the replacement in all continents apart from Africa. So that method, by increasing even further the number of researchers, that's going to level out. And then secondly, well, how much larger a percentage of the population can we put towards R&D? Well, that's got a natural cap of 100%. Yeah. Probably the actual cap is much lower than that. But again, we know that can't increase indefinitely. And so the prediction from the kind of leading long-run growth model, semi-endogenous growth theory, is that given this plateauing of fertility and the limited gains you can have by increasing the proportion of the population, dedicated to R&D, you get declining growth rates that then kind of plateau, and you get kind of a long-run stagnation.
Yeah. I guess another reason why someone might think that this could happen or will happen is that, so if you look over long periods in history, I guess you have the hunter-gatherer era, in which the kind of the human population or productivity was rising very slowly, and this was then reflected in like very gradually growing global human population.
Yep.
Then you had kind of a farming era where growth rates rose to a new level, but they were still very low by today's standards. And so again, over the long haul, over like 10,000 years, you had very gradual growth in human population. And then we have kind of the Industrial Revolution, which like really kicks things into the gear that we're familiar with, where you have like things are really changing over a single person's lifetime after 1750. There's all kinds of new things going on. Global economic growth rates are something like 3 or 4% per year. Then, however, we kind of have, a lot of people have argued that since about 1970, the rate of productivity improvement or the rate of innovations that are actually useful has declined relative to what it was between 1800 and 1970. And so possibly we're already seeing the effect that you're talking about, where we can't increase the number of people doing interesting R&D quickly enough to offset the fact that we're running out, that the ideas are getting harder and harder to find. That might have already bitten to some degree.
That's right. And so, economists measure kind of technological progress in this metric called the total factor productivity. And that's shown pretty consistent downward trend over, as I understand it, the last 50 years. So that's what the kind of data suggests. And then there's this qualitative argument of just, if you look at all of the changes that happened between, let's say, 1870 and 1920, and between 1920 and 1970, it's just like each interval, just enormous, like electrification is huge, indoor plumbing is huge,
also, revolutions in social structure as well, and how people were coordinated.
Yeah. What are you thinking of in particular? Yeah.
Oh, well, I was thinking, like going from 1800 to 1970, it's like we've gone from a world where almost everyone lives in a monarchy and like no one in a democracy, to a world where like we have like communism and like liberal democracy. It was like big changes in how people think about how humanity ought to be organized.
And then from 1970 to 1920, there's been huge changes in communications and information technology, undoubtedly, but then pretty incremental changes everywhere else.
Yeah.
And so some people argue that, that shows we're already, in a great stagnation or approaching a great stagnation. I'm sympathetic to that. Having said that, that's not necessary for the argument to work.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess as long-termists, thinking about very long term, you might think, does it really matter that much whether like the next 20 or 30 or 40 years are kind of a bit quiet technologically? Yeah, why should we care from a long-termist perspective about the possibility that there is a stagnation for decades, possibly centuries?
There are two reasons, I think, two main reasons. One is that if we get stuck in what Carl Sagan called the time of perils, like a period of heightened extinction risk, then that increases total extinction risk. So imagine that it's 50 years' time. We now have weapons that can create engineered pathogens. We don't have the defenses against them. That requires more advanced technology. And then we get stuck there. Then, I don't know, let's say it's 0.1% annual risk. Or if we get stuck there for centuries or even longer, then that adds up to, really significant risk overall.
That will never make it out.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one reason, it's a kind of existential risk factor. The second is kind of more unclear in how it goes, but it's this values consideration again, where you might think that, what are the values that are predominant today? What are the values that kind of restart civilization in hundreds of years? Or restart economic progress in hundreds of years? You might think they're better, like perhaps like that's a chance for kind of moral progress to kind of march on. But again, if you think that liberal democracy is somewhat fragile, like it's not a guarantee at all, you might well think that actually the values are worse over this time period after like a long stagnation.
Yeah, I think this argument is kind of famously made in, Benjamin Friedman's book? The moral consequences of economic growth, I think.
Exactly, yeah. His argument is a little bit different. Okay. He's just saying, well, when the economy is growing, people are happy, you get like cooperation because you can work together and you're going to like grow the pie kind of together.
Yeah.
If the economy is kind of stagnant, then people start
bickering about shares.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's plausible. And he claims the kind of evidence supports him. I think it's plausible at least. I'm not sure I'm very confident. in that hypothesis.
Yeah. And how is your theory different than what Friedman said?
Well, mine's different because what Friedman's talking about is very short timescales, really like years or decades of, whereas I'm talking about, and within like, say, a liberal democracy, whereas I'm saying, okay, over the course of hundreds of years, the predominant social structures could be extremely different. So let's say we do think that, liberal democracy is this kind of contingent, fragile thing. Well, maybe we have, it's dictatorship or authoritarian rule that
so your argument isn't that
evolves in like hundreds of years' time.
I see. So your argument is less that the stagnation will specifically cause us to cease to become, but merely that if we wait for ages, then things could get worse. And like,
absolutely.
In as much as we think humanity is in a reasonable position now, perhaps we don't want to roll the dice and just see how things are in 2300.
Yeah. And in the book, I just like come out as agnostic on like the values question. I think I more want to point to this as like, this is a really important consideration either way, and maybe like more research needed because it's a big deal. It's just that I'm not like super confident what the sign is.
Yeah. Okay. What probability do you place on a stagnation scenario of some sort, like actually happening?
Yeah, in the book, in this embedded footnote, I gave it kind of 1 in 3. I think that's a little high now. Like as in over the course of centuries, like tending towards stagnation.
Yeah.
But not like, wildly high. Like I think it's a scenario like very plausibly on the table.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything that you think that we should or could plausibly do now that will help in the stagnation scenario that doesn't make things worse in other scenarios?
Well, I think it maybe is like a reason, there's this question of like, should you speed up or slow down AI progress? And that's like very difficult question in general, like lots of factors on either side. This is kind of one factor on that side, on the side of like it going faster because...
Or at least like not actively shutting it down or slowing it down.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Like there's, another risk from delaying it massively where, these arguments I've given, like, oh, how on earth could you increase kind of the search, the amount of labor going into R&D, like when we've plateaued? Well, one answer would be like you've automated it.
Yeah.
And so effectively you have like AI researchers. And then I just think we're off to the races. Then it's like,
I mean, to be honest,
the stagnation world is like a long timeline, AI timelines world for sure.
I see. Yeah, I mean, it seems like, producing artificial intelligence that can do its own R&D is kind of the main path out of stagnation, or at least the main way to speed things up again, because it doesn't seem like we're on track to figure out how to get people to have like massive families and grow population again, even if that were desirable. Nor does it seem like we have a ton of potential to increase the number of PhD students 10 or 100-fold in future, or super educated people. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately it's about AI and like, when do we get it? So yeah, the stagnation worries in general are like long timeline worries. So I think we'd get like a extra century of technological progress is my understanding given the standard models. Do we get to the point of time at which we can automate R&D by then?
Hold on. You're saying, I guess we can project this, can't we? Because we can say, well, population's going to kind of be like this. This is how we expect education to shift.
Exactly.
And then you might and you're saying like after the equivalent of 100 more years of the growth rate that we have now, things just basically cap out.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Huh. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on. I hadn't heard that one. Yeah.
So there's a question of, do we get to automated R&D in that point in time? And pretty good chance we do, but maybe we don't. Then what are the solutions to ensure we don't stagnate? Like, for example, what we could be doing now is like, okay, what things can we do that like increase the chance that we do get to the point at which you can have automated R&D? So there are some things you could do, like, there's still enormous numbers of people around the world who are not able to meaningfully contribute to the kind of research frontier because they're born into poverty. They just don't have the opportunities, but yet they could make huge contributions. So that's a really big thing. Yeah, as you kind of intimated, attempts to increase population size. So there's a weird thing at the moment where people are having fewer kids than they want.
Yeah.
And so even just getting people to have the number of kids they want would be like a huge a huge positive.
Yeah, this actually shows up in I saw a graph recently showing household income as against how many children you have, and perhaps not shockingly, it initially goes down as I suppose people get more career focused up until the point where they're like upper middle class, and then as you get like very wealthy, then it goes back up again. People start having more children, presumably because now they actually have the financial slack, and perhaps they have the leisure time from being sufficiently earning enough per hour that now they can have kind of the family size that they originally wanted.
That's okay. That's I didn't know that fact. But it is very hard to increase family sizes if you're a government. So Hungary has spent 5% of its GDP trying to incentivize larger families. And I think they moved the fertility rate from 1.5 to 1.7.
Okay.
It's like the impact. I
see.
So it's like very hard indeed.
Yeah.
I think another thing one could do, though, in combination with this, finding the potential research talent from all around the world, is also just having kind of more accelerated programs that are, things that are just much more targeted. We do this with athletics. These scouts, they go all around the world, they try and find the most promising people, and they get put on these most promising footballers, they get put on these fast tracks to become professional athletes. You could do the same, but with professional researchers, and they get directed towards areas of R&D that seem like potentially likely to kind of pay off in terms of, further technological progress.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, as we're getting to the end of the conversation, it's probably, it's worth turning our minds to what this might all mean for like what you and I and listeners, I guess, should be getting up to. I mean, there's tons of ideas out there about this, and a decent fraction of them we've talked about in lots of previous episodes when it comes to bio, AI, preventing war. I guess one we haven't talked that much about that you've flagged is improving clean energy research. But it'd be good to do some episodes on that. Yeah, I suppose to try to add some value in this episode above and beyond all of the other resources that we have on this question of what does long-termism imply, how do your personal ideas for what we ought to prioritize differ from other people who research or write about long-termism? Yeah,
so I think I'm even more in favor. I mean, it's tough because people are already pretty in favor of this, but I think even more in favor of growth of effective altruism as an idea in a community where, I think values promotion is important. Growing EA is kind of two things. One, it's a sort of investment where you've got more resources to put to good things in the future. But it's also, I think, like a path, hopefully to a good future where imagine a world in 200 years, let's say, where there's just this general culture of people are motivated by impartial moral concern. They use evidence and careful reasoning to try and work out what that is. When they disagree with people, they have these level arguments that they're trying to understand the other point of view. When the disagreement's intractable, there's a strong default of cooperation.
Or compromising.
Or compromise. And that's just a global culture. It's looking pretty good. Yeah. I'm feeling kind of happy about the world there compared to now. So, I think that becomes a kind of even better thing. Another thing that I'm particularly concerned about is preserving and promoting liberal democracies where, again, I had this consideration of, how do you evaluate nuclear war? Do you just look at the extinction risk? I think no. I think the fact that it would be a loss of potential just wiping of liberal democracy off the map, I think is...
It's a downside?
Huge. Huge downside. I think that also means for other things that might seem like very broad activities, like looking at India and helping India in kind of economic growth as the world's largest economy. Also perhaps, guiding away from kind of Hindu nationalism and some of the kind of, more authoritarian strains in kind of Indian political thought could be a very important thing. Similarly, authoritarian strains in the US too. Not going to name many names. So those things seem extremely important to me too. And then, I think, I'm not sure quite how much this pops out of the book, but I'm also just generally more concerned by war, I think, than perhaps other people are, where, what's my credence that there's a great, equivalent of World War III, a war between great powers in our lifetimes? I don't know, 40% or something.
Wow, that's high. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's just...
I suppose that's the base rate.
It's kind of the base rate. It's also, if you look at Metaculus and the predictions that it makes and extend it over the course of... I mean, I guess maybe lifetime. I was thinking by 2100, but I don't know, 1 in 3 or something. It's really surprisingly high. And then I just then I have this view, just a lot of things go a lot worse. So I guess part of my, I do have lower kind of existential risk numbers than some other people, such as Toby. And part of that is just this view that society, like it's really messy and can be hard, but like is self-correcting in the sense like, okay, there's, risks from novel pathogens, but then you've also got people like Kevin Esvelt making sure that we reduce those risks. And there's this big asymmetry where it's like, look, people don't want to catastrophically die, and so those arguments are going to like systematically kind of win over coming decades.
Yeah.
Then, I don't know, I feel like when people are in like a state of going to war, like all bets are off.
I see.
You have something like the USSR biological weapons program, employed 60,000 people really devoting itself to try and figure out the like nastiest viruses you can.
Yeah, it's like, terrible for the world, and also probably terrible for the USSR, and yet because of the kind of Cold War situation, they were able to make mistakes like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not, again, like I think in general, people act like fairly rationally in their own self-interest. Again, like in war kind of scenarios, even that can go out the window to some extent. And not just the fact that they're now making decisions with stakes where it's like, oh, okay, we're maybe just like off the map unless we do this crazy thing.
Yeah. Is it bad that when you say there's like a 40% chance of us having a great power war in our lifetimes, my first thought is like, why am I saving so much for retirement? I just think like, I need to spend more on my holidays. I'm saving for a future that won't exist.
Yeah, that's probably bad. I think your thought should be
a little bit self-focused, isn't it?
I think your thought should maybe be like, yeah, let's make that war not happen.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, probably won't succeed at that. So I can definitely pull money out of my retirement account. Where do you donate personally?
So my last donation was to the Lead Elimination Exposure Project.
Nice.
Which is quite interesting because, I was doing that. There was two grounds. So for those who don't know, it's a new organization incubated within the effective altruism community, which tries to eliminate lead paint and ultimately like lead exposure from all sorts of sources. Lead exposure is just really bad. It's like really bad from a health perspective. Also lowers people's IQ, lowers their general cognitive functioning. Some evidence that it kind of increases violence and social dysfunction. And then LEAP, as they're called, have just already had like ton of traction. So going to Malawi and basically just getting the government of Malawi to enforce
anti-lead
regulation against lead paint. So it seems like, oh wow, they're really making traction. This is an example of kind of, very broad long-termist action where I think this sort of intervention is maybe kind of different from certain other sorts of global health and development programs where, if I imagine a world that's just like people are a bit smarter, they don't have, mild brain damage from lead exposure that has lowered their IQ and, made them like more impulsive, more violent, just like broadly seems like a much better society. And then that was the first argument. And then the second was just, I think it's really good for EAs to be like doing things in the world, like really making it better, achieving concrete wins. And
getting skills.
And I'm aware that my donation is like, has a symbolic value as well as just being a place where money kind of goes. And so, I really wanted to kind of recognize and reward that. But then the final thing is just that, that actually seemed to me like in being like in real need of money and further funding in a way that like lots of the maybe the more core kind of narrowly targeted long-termist work is not currently. And so my sense is like a lot of the best giving opportunities are more in the like stuff that's a bit kind of broader because that really hasn't been like as much of a focus of grant makers.
Yeah. Okay, well, we have sufficiently exhausted you. So it's time to release you back into the wild. Last time, in our last interview, we spoke a bunch about potatoes and your obsession with potatoes, and you justified that. Is there any kind of topic that you've recently gotten obsessed with, which has maybe taken the baton from potatoes in terms of pointless, massive interests?
Well, and I should say the potato stuff, in the last podcast, I made a comment about this persistent study about how potatoes had this enormous long-run impact, and I commented, it probably doesn't check out.
Yeah.
Turns out it checks out. So my interest in potatoes was vindicated all along. It's the most important technology ever invented. Or
nice.
among the most important.
We'll go and issue a correction to that episode.
Okay, please do. Another topic that I got, really down the rabbit hole and slightly obsessed with, again, coincidentally during pandemic lockdown period, was megafauna, in particular extinct megafauna, where I do include this at the start of chapter 2 of the book.
Yeah.
But, we normally think that megafauna, that is animals that are larger than about human size or larger. I think it's above 45 kilograms. There are a lot of them in Africa. So you've got rhinoceroses, hippopotami, giraffes, just diversity of like very large animals, elephants, but not really as much in other places in the world. It's like much, much, much fewer. And you might think, well, that's because of something to do with kind of Africa's ecological niche or something. No. It's because of humans. It's because human beings evolved in Africa. We co-evolved with these large animals. And so they evolved to escape humans as a predator.
Whoa.
But then there was the great migration out of Africa. Humans in evolutionary times very quickly spread to all corners of the globe. And systematically, when humans arrived in a certain area, it wasn't that long afterwards that most of the large animals went extinct. And okay, this is interesting in a few ways. One is it's just an example of early humans having extremely persistent effects. Because again, like with the human species, once some other species is extinct, it's very hard to come back from that. Possible, there are efforts to de-extinct certain animals. A second, though, is just the animals were wild. I mean, like in South America, there were the glyptodonts. They're my personal favorite, which are just they're a sister family of the armadillos, but they're the size of a car. So like a Ford Fiesta would weigh like, somewhere between like 800 kilograms, even up to 2 tons. And covered in this carapace of like hard shell. Humans would kill them and like use the shell for, what's the hypothesis, as well as for meat, kill them for having this protective armor essentially. They were blind during the day, which is like bizarre. So like just adapted to low light. So that was just like one example of these megafauna. There was also the giant ground sloth, Megatherium.
Yeah. How big are they?
2 tons. Okay. So again, like African elephant in size, but a ground sloth could stand on 2 legs because they were herbivorous, to get kind of leaves from trees.
Did it move? I guess we don't know if it moved really slowly, but
great question. I don't know.
It doesn't show up in the fossil record.
Many kind of elephant-like creatures in South America. Camels in Asia, in Europe. So if they hadn't gone extinct, we're like, go to Spain, go on a camel. On a camel ride. Haste eagles. I mean, they were actually a little later, so it went extinct in 1400. The largest bird species we know of. They would hunt moa. These large flightless birds. Yeah. I think moa themselves were like really quite large. The number I've got in my head is that they were like 200 kilograms, which is like very big. But Haas eagles were like 20, I think like half the weight of a human or something, and like 2.6 meter wingspan.
I see.
And they would hunt these like enormous, flightless birds. Huh. Yeah. But then the moa got made extinct by humans, and so the Haas eagles died off too.
Right.
And so in these cases, it's not just that humans were, necessarily killing the animals directly, but they were just having untold ecological damage.
I see.
And so there's often this narrative of like, the kind of like early humans, like before we had technology, we were living in accordance with nature. It's like, no. We were responsible for the extinction of most megafauna. Yeah. We're burning vast swathes of forest land in order to like make hunting easier. I mean, it's just actually like terrifying. Yeah. And then the most striking of all is the other Homo species. So, multiple other human species. So the Denisovans, Neanderthals, Homo floresiensis, and a few others. And Homo sapiens just... In some cases, Denisovans and Neanderthals, there was some interbreeding, but again, outcompeting. And this is, again, like it's a kind of contingent fact that there's only one human species. Yeah. Like, again, this is just kind of, there's not necessarily a lesson here, apart from just boggling that, like, we could have had a world where there were, like, 2 different human species. Yeah. Think how, like, different our morality would have been. In particular, like, there's this strain of moral thought which really places humans on this pedestal far above other animals. Well, if there'd been like 2 human species, would that have happened? Maybe not.
Yeah. I think what I take away is that humans are cold-blooded killers.
I mean, I think that's kind of the... have you read about persistence hunting?
No.
Okay, so...
this is the thing where they outrun them, right?
Yeah, this is another thing I got a little bit impressed by. Humans are like actually very strange physically. Yeah. So we're one of the only creatures that sweat, us and horses. And we're incredibly good long-distance runners. Mm. And humans evolved in significant part to hunt animals over very long time periods. So you're a zebra. I'm an early human. We're on the kind of, plains in Africa. I will see you and I'll start chasing you down. It's like 11 a.m., like blazing hot sun. and I just start jogging after you, slowly. You run away out of the horizon. I can track you, but not just that like some zebra is running away from me. I can identify one particular zebra and how that's different from others. And I just keep jogging after you. You see me again on the horizon, you run away. This happens again and again over the course of many hours until you just collapse from heat stroke and exhaustion. And then I stand over you, strangle you to death, and then eat you. Terrifying, like utterly terrifying.
Yeah.
And that was early human hunting. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, again,
that's what we're born to do.
That's what we're born to do, exactly. And it's like, that's partly why that's why we're such good long distance runners. We also had advantage of like very early tool use. So being able to carry water, like we didn't have to like lug around, water over, with our bodies, but at the same time we could carry it some distance.
Yeah.
Was like very helpful for this.
So
I
feel like
I know. I think there's just like
enormous
this is a
amounts. Positive note to end the podcast. We usually try to go for something fun and positive, to inspire people to action. I guess the thing I'm going to go away and do is figure out. People always say, humans lived in like harmony with nature. I feel like I want to modify that to humans lived in harmony with nature after they killed everything that they could. Then what was left that they couldn't get rid of, no matter what they did, that they lived in harmony with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here was another aspect of it was funny. Was just how incredibly... So we were doing this fact-checking. We really want everything to be rigorous. Probably the issue that we got the most heat on out of the whole book, not abolition of slavery, that's a like, sensitive
small
topic.
Fry. Yeah.
No, it was the question of what killed off the megafauna, where I really think that if you look at the literature, it's just very, very strong arguments that humans played a decisive role. I'm not claiming like it was a human cause for every single megafaunal extinction, but the large majority. A lot of people really hate that, and they claim it's like climate change. There's this kind of current of thought that we should not like overemphasize like humans, But actually, I think like the more I learned about kind of evolution and early human history and cultural evolution, is just like actually humans are just like radically different species.
Yeah.
We've been having this enormous environmental impact since the first since Homo sapiens like first evolved and spread across the globe.
Wow. Here's to that.
Yeah. Cool.
My guest today has been Will MacAskill, and the book is What We Owe the Future. Thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, a few closing notices now. This notice I didn't tease at the start because it's just for people dedicated enough to make it to the end of a long episode like this. I'm looking to chat to 5 or 10 randomly selected subscribers to the show in order to get a better sense of who's out there and what you're looking to get out of all of these episodes. If you're open to helping out with that, go to 80,000hours.org/podcast chat, lowercase, all one word. Put your name and email in there, and if the random number generator picks you out, then I'll send you a link to book a 20-minute call with me at some hopefully convenient time. I look forward to virtually meeting a few of you and getting a better understanding of who's really listening in on all of these conversations. Second, as I mentioned in the intro, we're extending the closing date for this year's user survey because we haven't gotten as many responses as we need or hope for, or indeed as we know are out there. So you've got 2 more days to get those in, which means the end of Wednesday. It's important to fill out because the user survey is the main way we figure out what, among all of the many things 80,000 Hours does, are most helpful and which are not useful or potentially even harmful. You can fill it out at 80,000hours.org/survey. Naturally, the team here has to be constantly thinking about what to write next, what roles to hire for, which podcast episode to produce next, and so on. And your input can be extremely valuable in terms of doing that. The previous survey helped get me working on the podcast full time, and people telling us what they wanted from future episodes got us to interview David Denkenberger a second time, and to cover new problems in interviews with Cal Newport and Nina Sheik, among others. We have a fair few things going on at 80,000 Hours, including this show, our other show, 80K After Hours, our job board, our various different kinds of research articles, our one-on-one advising, and our marketing efforts now in order to reach new folks. So prioritization can be a challenge, and there's a lot of topics you might be able to give us useful advice on. Normally, we only do this once a year, but we actually skipped it in 2021 so that we could stay focused on just delivering more of our projects. But that means we're particularly keen to know how things have shifted for users over the last 2 years, during a time when things have changed for 80,000 Hours. We've grown and changed a bunch, and I imagine they've changed for most of you as well. For that reason, if you filled out the survey a few years ago, it's pretty likely that your plans and opinions about us have changed since then. So if you're open to filling it out again, we would really appreciate it. We're keen to hear how 80,000 Hours might have affected your plans for doing good, both in your career and elsewhere, and to get feedback from anyone who's engaged with us but hasn't in any way changed their plans. On average, people take about 25 minutes to fill it out, if you were moving fast or had simple things to say, you could probably get through it in 10 or 15 minutes. On the other hand, someone with a more complex story and subtle things they wanted to get through to us would, of course, take longer. However much you write, I can promise you every entry gets read all the way through here by multiple people. That's 80,000hours.org/survey. Pushing on, as I mentioned in the intro, 80,000 Hours is currently looking for a new marketer. From the start of the year, we've begun investing quite a lot more heavily in getting the word out about what we have to offer, since that's a very natural way to do more good as an organization. Since then, we have found a few things that we think are working, and so we want to try doing more of them. But to make that happen, we need more people focused on marketing than just Bella Forrestal. Someone who'd be right for this role would be pretty excited about effective altruism or 80,000 Hours mission, and they might have a background in marketing, especially digital or influencer marketing, but our experience is that that's not so essential, and we do want to hear from people without jobs like that on their CV as well. This isn't exactly a traditional marketing position since we are a nonprofit and we're not actually selling anything in exchange for money, so we would love you to apply even if you aren't otherwise thinking of yourself as a professional marketer per se. The role is full-time. Ideally, it would be done in person at our office in London, and it would pay around £60,000 assuming you had little or no prior experience, but more if you do. If that piques your interest at all, you can find plenty more about the position at 80,000hours.org/marketer. Keep in mind, applications close pretty soon on the 23rd of August. All right, kudos to you if you stuck with us through all of that. The 80,000 Hours podcast is produced and edited by Kieran Harris. Audio mastering and technical editing by Ben Cordell. Full transcripts and an extensive collection of links to learn more are available on our site and put together by Katie Moore. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.